I spent 12 years in a federal penitentiary for a crime I did not commit, trusting my business partner to protect my $80 million company and the woman I loved. The day I got out, I walked into my own boardroom to find him selling my empire and married to my wife. I did not scream or throw a punch. I quietly folded the $1,000 hush money check he offered me, walked out, and called my lawyer. I simply said, "Your time is up." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who thought they could bury you and get away with it. The automatic glass doors of the high-rise parted with a soft hiss, welcoming me into a world that no longer recognized me. 12 years ago, I signed the lease on this building. I selected the Italian marble for the lobby floor, and I designed the security protocols that were currently meant to keep men like me out. The brass letters on the wall used to read Maxwell Logistics. Now the polished sign declared Langdon Global to anyone who walked through the doors. I stood in the center of the atrium, wearing a suit that was 12 years out of style, the fabric hanging loosely on a frame that had been hardened by a decade of prison yard survival. People in tailored wool and sharp heels flowed past me, averting their eyes. To them, I was a glitch in their pristine environment. To me, they were trespassing in my house. I approached the security turnstile, pulling a cracked, faded plastic keycard from my breast pocket. It was my original founder access card. I had kept it hidden in my personal effects locker at the penitentiary, a daily reminder of the life waiting for me. I pressed the worn plastic against the scanner. A harsh, descending beep echoed, and the turnstile indicator flashed an angry red. Access denied. I tried again. The same red flash. The system did not just reject the card, it did not know the card existed. My digital footprint in the empire I built from the ground up had been thoroughly wiped clean. "Sir, step away from the gate." The voice belonged to a young security guard, his hand resting casually near his radio. He looked me up and down, taking in my outdated suit, the graying hair cropped close to my scalp, and the hollowed-out look that only a decade of concrete and steel can carve into a man's face. "You need to step back," the guard repeated, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension reserved for vagrants. "This is a private corporate building. If you do not have an appointment or an active badge, I am going to have to ask you to leave before I call the police." I looked at the young man. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to demand respect or shout that my sweat and blood had paid for the uniform he was wearing. Prison teaches you that arguing with the gatekeeper is a waste of breath. You do not fight the wall. You find the crack in it. I simply nodded, took a step back, and turned toward the exit. The guard relaxed, satisfied that he had handled a potential nuisance. But I did not walk out the front doors. I veered sharply to the left, slipping down a narrow corridor designated for maintenance staff and deliveries. 12 years is a long time, but concrete and steel do not change their nature. When I oversaw the retrofitting of this building, I insisted on a dedicated freight elevator that bypassed the main lobby security matrix specifically for transporting sensitive server equipment directly to the executive floors. I knew the architectural blueprints better than the back of my hand. I reached the heavy metal door of the freight bay. The electronic keypad was new, but the mechanical override panel beneath it was exactly where I had installed it. I popped the cover, reached inside, and triggered the manual release. The heavy doors slid open with a metallic groan. I stepped inside the dark utilitarian box, pressed the button for the top floor, and felt the elevator lurch upward, carrying me straight into the heart of the betrayal. The ascent was slow, smelling of industrial grease and stale air, a stark contrast to the perfumed lobby below. With every passing floor, the reality of my situation crystallized. 12 years ago, the federal government came down on Maxwell Logistics like a hammer. They found massive offshore tax discrepancies, illegal shell companies, and fraudulent ledgers. None of it was my doing. It was Miles. Miles Langdon, my partner, my supposed best friend, the man I trusted with the operational finances while I built the logistical network. When the feds offered a plea deal, Miles came to me in tears. He told me that if we both fought it, the company would be seized, the assets frozen, and we would lose everything. He begged me to take the fall as the sole acting CEO. He promised on his life that he would maintain my 50% equity in a blind trust, and more importantly, that he would take care of Valerie. Valerie, my wife, the woman I loved more than the company, more than my own freedom. I looked at her terrified face in the courtroom and made the choice. I plead guilty. I took a 12-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary so she would not lose her home, her lifestyle, or her dignity. Miles swore he would protect my empire and my family until I returned. The freight elevator jerked to a halt. The doors slid open, revealing the polished oak corridor of the executive suite. I stepped out the thick plush carpet, silencing my footsteps. From down the hall, I heard the unmistakable sound of celebration. The clinking of crystal, the murmur of wealthy laughter, the popping of a champagne cork. I walked slowly toward the main boardroom, the double glass doors standing wide open. Inside it was a scene of absolute opulence. Caterers wove through a crowd of executives in sharp suits. At the head of the massive mahogany table stood Miles Langdon. He looked older, his hair silver, his waistline thicker, radiating the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He was raising a glass, speaking to a group of men wearing the distinct predatory smiles of corporate acquisition buyers. And standing right beside him, her arm looped intimately through his, was Valerie. She was draped in diamonds that caught the light of the chandelier, wearing a designer silk dress, laughing at something one of the buyers had said. She did not look like a woman who had spent 12 years waiting for her wrongfully imprisoned husband. She looked like a queen ruling an empire built on my bones. I stepped into the doorway. I did not announce myself. I did not need to. My presence in that room was a sudden drop in barometric pressure. The caterer closest to the door stopped moving. One of the executives turned, his smile faltering as he took in my rigid posture and outdated suit. The silence spread like a virus, rippling across the room until every conversation died. Miles was mid-sentence, boasting about the seamless integration of their logistics fleet, when he noticed the dead silence. He turned his head, his glass of champagne hovering in the air. His eyes locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, I saw absolute, unadulterated terror flash across his face. The glass in his hand trembled, spilling a few drops of expensive wine onto the polished table. Valerie turned to follow his gaze. When she saw me, the blood drained from her face, leaving her pale and ghostly under the bright lights. She instinctively tightened her grip on Miles's arm, a gesture of solidarity that felt like a physical blow to my chest. Gordon Miles breathed out, his voice cracking, before he hastily cleared his throat, trying to recover his composure in front of the prospective buyers. "Hello, Miles," I said, my voice steady, carrying through the dead, silent room. "You started the celebration without me. I hope I am not interrupting the board meeting." The buyers exchanged confused, nervous glances. One of them, a man with a sharp jawline, looked at Miles. "Miles, who is this man? Is there an issue with the facility?" Miles forced a laugh, a hollow grating sound. No, of course not. Just a confused former employee. Someone from a long time ago who seems to have lost his way." He set his glass down, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "Gentlemen, if you will excuse us for a moment. It seems we have a minor security breach that I need to handle personally." I did not break eye contact with Miles as I stepped fully into the room. "I am not a former employee, Miles. I am the founder of this company. I am the man who built the infrastructure you are currently trying to sell. And I am here to reclaim my office." Valerie stepped forward. There was no tears in her eyes. There was no shock or guilt or remorse. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, cold disdain. She reached into a sleek designer portfolio resting on the table, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and walked toward me. The woman I had sacrificed my freedom for, the woman whose letters had stopped coming. In my 3rd year of prison, stopped 3 feet away from me. "You do not have an office here, Gordon," she said, her voice icy, devoid of any warmth we had ever shared. "You do not own anything here." She thrust the envelope toward my chest. I did not take it. It fell to the floor, sliding open to reveal heavily stamped legal documents. The bold letters at the top of the first page read, "Restraining order." "You need to leave," Valerie hissed, keeping her voice low so the buyers would not hear the panic underneath. "You are violating a court order just by breathing the air in this room. If you do not turn around and walk back to whatever gutter you crawled out of, I will have the police drag you out in handcuffs." I looked down at the documents, then back up at her. "When did you stop being my wife, Valerie?" I asked quietly. "Was it the day the gates closed behind me, or did you wait until the money cleared?" She did not flinch. "It was year 3, Gordon. Year 3, when Miles legally proved you had abandoned your fiduciary duties to the corporation due to your incarceration. The board voted to dissolve your shares to protect the company from your criminal reputation. It was completely legal. And as for our marriage, it ended the moment you became a convicted felon. Miles was here. He protected me. He took care of the mess you left behind." She said it with such absolute conviction, as if I had been the one to steal from the company, as if my sacrifice had been a crime against her. Miles had not just stolen my company. He had rewritten the history of our lives. He had convinced the board, the market, and my own wife that my imprisonment was a liability he had heroically saved them from, rather than the very shield that kept them out of a cell. Miles stepped up beside Valerie, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulder. The image made my stomach churn, but I kept my face impassive. "Gordon, this is embarrassing for everyone," Miles said, dropping his voice to a dangerous murmur. "You have been gone a long time. The world moved on. Maxwell Logistics died the day you went away. This is Langdon Global now. I built this merger. I secured this $80 million buyout. You have no equity, you have no legal standing, and you are standing in a room full of people who view you as a liability. Do not make me call security to throw you out like trash." I looked at the buyers. They were shifting uncomfortably, whispering to their legal aides. The pristine environment of their corporate acquisition was being stained by the reality of my presence. Miles was desperate to get me out of sight before I derailed his massive payday. "Let us go to my office, Gordon," Miles said, his tone suddenly shifting to a placating, patronizing calm. "Let us handle this privately. Valerie, stay here and assure our guests that everything is fine." I did not resist as Miles gestured toward a heavy frosted glass door at the far end of the suite. I walked past Valerie close enough to smell the expensive perfume she wore, a scent paid for by my 12 years in a concrete box. She refused to look at me, staring straight ahead as I passed. Miles opened the door and ushered me inside. It was a massive corner office overlooking the city skyline. My old office. He had completely redecorated it, replacing my drafting tables with modern sterile glass and leather. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing us in complete silence. The glass was soundproof. The party outside became a silent movie. Miles dropped the polite facade instantly. He walked over to his desk, his face twisting with irritation and contempt. "What the hell is wrong with you, Gordon? Walking in here today of all days. Did you really think you could just waltz out of a federal pen and demand a seat at the table?" I remained standing in the center of the room. "You promised Miles. You looked me in the eye 12 years ago and promised you would hold my shares in trust. You promised you would look after Valerie until I got out." Miles let out a harsh, cruel laugh. "I did look after Valerie. I married her. And I looked after the company by cutting out the dead weight. Do you honestly think I was going to let an $80 million enterprise stall out because my partner was eating off a metal tray in a prison cafeteria? The market doesn't wait for anyone, Gordon. I had to restructure. I had to execute an aggressive dilution of your assets to keep the investors happy. It was business. It was survival. You forged a board vote while I was legally unable to defend myself," I stated, maintaining my calm. "You used the tax fraud you committed to label me a liability, then you cannibalized my life's work to make yourself rich." Miles leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. "Prove it. Go ahead, Gordon. Try to prove it. You have nothing. You are a convicted felon with zero credibility. I am a respected CEO about to close the biggest merger in this industry's history. I have the best corporate lawyers in the country on retainer. If you try to sue me, I will bury you in litigation until you are dead. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life answering discovery motions from a cardboard box. He opened a drawer in his desk, pulled out a sleek leather checkbook, and clicked a gold pen. He scribbled something, quickly ripped the check from the book, and walked over to me. He did not hand it to me. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table between us. I am not an unreasonable man, Gordon Miles sneered. I know it is hard for guys like you to transition back into society. Consider this a relocation stipend. Take it, buy yourself a bus ticket to somewhere far away, get a cheap apartment, and start over. If I ever see your face near this building or near my wife again, I will have you thrown back in prison for violating the restraining order. I looked down at the table. The check was made out to Gordon Maxwell. The amount was exactly $1,000. $1,000 for 12 years of my life. $1,000 for an $80 million company. $1,000 for the wife he stole from me. Miles was not showing mercy. He was asserting absolute dominance. He wanted me to pick up that piece of paper so he could watch me accept my defeat. He treated me like a stray dog that had wandered into his pristine home, tossing a scrap of meat to make me go away. I looked at Miles. I saw a man who had grown soft on stolen luxury. He had spent 12 years surrounded by people who told him he was a genius, insulated by lawyers and wealth. He had forgotten what real pressure looked like. He had forgotten that I was the architect of the system he was standing on. I reached down and picked up the check. Miles smirked, a look of profound satisfaction settling on his face. He thought he had won. He thought I was broken. I slowly folded the check in half, then in quarters, deliberately, methodically. I slipped the folded paper into the breast pocket of my outdated suit. I looked up at him, letting the silence stretch until his smirk began to falter, until the edges of his confidence began to fray. I did not yell. I did not threaten him with physical violence. I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile that did not reach my eyes. "Thank you, Miles," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I appreciate the gesture." I turned my back on him and walked toward the heavy glass door. "That is it," Miles demanded, his voice suddenly sharp, unsettled by my reaction. "You are just going to walk away?" I opened the door. The sound of the party rushed back in. Through the glass walls, I could see 2 large security guards stepping off the elevator, looking frantic, pointing toward the boardroom. Valerie was directing them toward the office. I paused in the doorway and looked back at the man who had stolen my life. "Enjoy the champagne, Miles." I stepped out of the office and walked directly toward the security guards. I held up my hands, showing I was not a threat, and allowed them to escort me toward the service elevator. I did not look at Valerie as I passed her. I did not look back at the boardroom. The last thing I saw, before the elevator doors closed, was Miles Langdon standing in the doorway of his office, his face pale, staring after me. My silence had done what shouting never could. It had planted the seed of absolute terror in his chest. I rode the elevator down to the loading dock and stepped out into the harsh afternoon sunlight of the city alleyway. I walked for 6 blocks until the towering glass structure of Langdon Global was just another shape in the skyline. I found a dilapidated convenience store, walked up to the ATM inside, and used the temporary debit card the prison had issued me to withdraw $20. I walked outside to a grime-covered payphone attached to a brick wall. I picked up the heavy receiver, dropped a handful of coins into the slot, and dialed a number I had memorized over a decade ago. It rang twice before a gruff, tired voice answered. "Law offices of Wallace Reed." "Wallace," I said, staring at the distant peak of the building I had just left. "It is Gordon. I am out." There was a heavy pause on the line, the sound of a chair squeaking, the rustle of papers. "Gordon, I did not expect you to call so soon. Did you go there? Did you see them?" "I saw them," I replied, my voice hard and cold. He is selling it, Wallace. He is selling the whole network for 80 million, and he thinks he has erased me completely. He offered me $1,000 to disappear. A low chuckle vibrated through the phone. Wallace Reed had been my corporate attorney before Miles pushed him out. He was a shark who had been forced into semi-retirement, waiting for the day I would finally be free. $1,000. Miles always was a cheap bastard. I assume you told him where he could shove it. No, I said, pulling this folded check from my pocket and looking at Miles's arrogant signature. I kept it. I am going to frame it. I need you to pull the offshore contingency files we discussed in year 4. The ones Miles never knew about. Are you sure? Gordon Wallace asked, his tone shifting to deadly serious. If we execute this, it is scorched earth. We are going to trigger federal alarms. If Miles catches us before we lock the trap, that restraining order will put you back in a cell by Friday. I looked at the concrete pavement beneath my worn shoes. I had survived 12 years in a cage by plotting the exact geometry of this destruction. Miles thought he had stolen an empire, but he had only stolen the walls. He did not know that the true foundation, the proprietary neural network algorithm that ran every logistical route, every automated dispatch, and every financial ledger of his precious company had never been transferred into the corporate charter. I am sure, Wallace, I said, gripping the phone tight enough to crack the plastic. Miles wants to pretend I am a ghost. Let us show him what a ghost can do to a machine. Your time is up. The teller behind the scratched, bulletproof glass did not look up when I slid the check into the metal tray. She just stamped it, counted out 10 crisp $100 bills, and pushed them back through the slot. I stood on the linoleum floor of the corner currency exchange, holding the exact monetary value Miles had assigned to 12 years of my silence. $1,000 for 80 million. $1,000 for the woman who used to sleep next to me. I folded the bills precisely in half and placed them into the breast pocket of my outdated suit. I felt no rage. Rage is a sloppy emotion. Prison strips you of sloppy emotions and replaces them with a cold, mechanical patience. I walked out into the suffocating afternoon heat. I did not search for a hotel. I walked 3 blocks to a discount electronics store and purchased a cheap, untraceable mobile phone with cash. From there, I walked to the transit terminal and bought a one-way bus ticket to the industrial docks on the south side of the city. I needed a place where the pristine suits of my former life never went. The bus ride was a slow crawl away from the towering glass spires of the financial district. I watched the glittering skyline fade into a sprawl of rusted warehouses, cracked asphalt, and chain-link fences. The air grew heavy with the smell of diesel and rotting salt water. When the bus finally lurched to a halt at the end of the line, I stepped out into the desolate quiet of the marina. Half-sunken fishing boats bobbed in the murky water. A few solitary figures moved in the shadows of the corrugated metal sheds, ignoring me entirely. This was the perfect place to resurrect a ghost. I did not use the burner phone yet. I walked down the cracked wooden pier until I found a rusted public payphone bolted to the side of a decaying bait shop. It was an antique, a relic from the world I left behind, but there was a dial tone humming through the heavy plastic receiver. I dropped a handful of coins into the slot and punched in a sequence of numbers that had been permanently burned into my memory for 4,380 days. The line rang 3 times, then a gruff, exhausted voice answered, "Law Offices of Wallace Reed." "Wallace," I said, staring out at the dark water churning against the wooden pylons. "It is Gordon. I am out." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. A heavy object clattered to the floor in Wallace's office, followed by the frantic rustling of paper. "Gordon." He breathed the word as if speaking to an apparition. I did not expect a call for another 6 months. "Where are you? Have you been to the tower? Did you see them?" "I saw them," I replied, my voice steady against the howling wind whipping off the harbor. I walked right into the boardroom. "Miles is selling it, Wallace. He is selling the entire logistical network to a corporate conglomerate for $80 million. He had Valerie standing right next to him. She handed me a restraining order. Miles handed me a check for $1,000 and told me to crawl into a gutter. A low, bitter chuckle vibrated through the receiver. Wallace Reed had been my fiercely loyal corporate attorney since the day I drafted the first business plan on a diner napkin. When the federal investigators raided our offices 12 years ago, Wallace fought like a rabid dog to keep me out of a cell. When I took the fall to save Valerie, Miles systematically forced Wallace into a forced semi-retirement, cutting his access to the firm. Wallace had been waiting in the shadows ever since sharpening his knives for the day I finally returned. $1,000, Wallace scoffed. Miles always possessed the arrogance of a cheap dictator. I assume you did not throw a punch and give Valerie a reason to call the police. I took the money, I said flatly. I kept the check. I need to know exactly how he did it, Wallace. I need to know how he legally erased me from a company I built with my own hands. Wallace sighed, the sound heavy with years of suppressed frustration. He used your sacrifice against you, Gordon. In year 3 of your sentence, Miles invoked a morality clause buried deep in our original corporate bylaws. He argued to the board of directors that your felony conviction for tax evasion made you a toxic liability to the brand. Because you were incarcerated and legally unable to perform fiduciary duties, he held a vote in absentia. He dissolved your 50% equity and redistributed the shares to himself and a few hand-picked executives. It was a hostile takeover executed entirely on paper while you were locked in a concrete box. He legally wiped you out of existence. I listened to the water slapping against the rotting wood of the pier. Every word Wallace spoke was designed to be a final nail in my coffin. But I was not preparing to die. I was preparing to flip the board. He wiped my name from the corporate charter, I said quietly. But what about the intellectual property, Wallace? Did he ever find the offshore holding company? There was a long, pregnant silence on the line. I could hear Wallace typing furiously on a keyboard. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled with the sudden, terrifying realization of what I was implying. Gordon, Wallace whispered, "You do not mean the Genesis Code." I meant exactly that. 12 years ago, while Miles was busy manipulating tax ledgers and skimming profits, I was locked in a basement server room, building the central nervous system of Maxwell Logistics. The Genesis Code was a proprietary neural network algorithm. It dictated every freight route, analyzed every fraction of fuel consumption, and managed automated dispatch for the entire global fleet. It was the only reason the company was worth $80 million today. But because Miles had been frantically rushing our incorporation papers to dodge an impending audit, I never formally transferred the final version of the software into the company's name. I had copyrighted the source code under an obscure offshore shell corporation for tax protection, a shell company that only Wallace and I knew existed. I never signed the transfer deed. I said, the cold marina wind biting at my face. The company Miles is currently selling relies entirely on a software architecture he does not legally own. He is negotiating an $80 million buyout with stolen property. I can hear Wallace typing furiously on a keyboard. The offshore shell is still active, Gordon. I kept paying the minimum registration fees out of my own pocket every year just in case. You are still listed as the sole proprietor of the intellectual property. If the buyers discover that Langdon Global does not own the core algorithm, they will instantly pull out of the merger. Miles will be completely ruined. The entire valuation will drop to zero in a matter of seconds. We can file an injunction tomorrow morning and freeze the sale. We cannot just file an injunction, I countered. If we simply send a legal threat, Miles will use his army of corporate lawyers to tie us up in litigation for the next decade. He will argue that the code was developed using company resources. He will bury us in paperwork until I die of old age. I do not want to tie him up in court, Wallace. I want to execute a total operational shutdown. I want to rip the steering wheel out of his hands while he is driving on the highway. How Wallace asked, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and awe. There is a dead man switch embedded in the original source code, I explained. I programmed it as a fail-safe in case our servers were ever hacked. If I activate that switch, the entire logistics network will instantly lock down. Every truck, every cargo ship, every automated warehouse will freeze, but I cannot trigger it remotely. The failsafe requires a physical decryption key that is hardwired into the primary legacy server. Where is the legacy server? Wallace asked. It is bolted to the floor in the basement of Langdon Global, I replied. The same building I am legally barred from entering. The same building surrounded by security guards who have explicit orders to arrest me on sight. The line went dead quiet. The magnitude of the obstacle hung between us. I had the weapon to completely annihilate the empire Miles had stolen, but the trigger was locked inside the fortress I had just been thrown out of. I had a restraining order demanding I stay 500 yards away from Valerie and the corporate headquarters. If I stepped 1 foot inside that lobby, I would violate my parole and go straight back to a maximum security prison for the rest of my life. I need the blueprints for the building's current see maintenance schedule, I said, staring up at the darkening sky. Miles thinks I am a broken old man sleeping on a bus bench. He is throwing a party on the top floor, while the foundation of his company sits unguarded in the basement. I am going back in tonight, Wallace. Gordon, you are risking everything, Wallace warned, his voice grave. If he catches you down there, it is over. I gripped the heavy plastic receiver. It was over 12 years ago when he let me put on a prison uniform for his crimes. I hung up the payphone and turned my back to the water. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the city into a deep, blood-red glow. Miles wanted to treat me like a ghost. It was time to show him what happens when a ghost haunts the machine. The peeling wallpaper of the roadside motel room seemed to vibrate under the sickly hum of a failing neon sign outside the window. Wallace Reed sat at a wobbly laminate table spreading out dozens of stolen corporate blueprints and illegally acquired merger documents. The sheer volume of paper represented a staggering theft. Miles Langdon had meticulously documented his $80 million valuation, detailing every warehouse, every truck, and every proprietary shipping route. But as Wallace ran his finger down the list of digital assets, his expression darkened into a grim mask of legal dread. Gordon stood by the window staring out at the desolate highway. He did not look at the papers. He did not need to. He had built the logistical architecture of the company in his mind 1,000 times over during his 12 years in a concrete cell. "We have a massive problem," Gordon Wallace said, tossing a pen onto the scattered documents. "Miles is arrogant, but his corporate lawyers are absolute sharks. If we file a federal injunction tomorrow morning claiming you hold the copyright to the Genesis Code, they will instantly file a motion to dismiss. They will argue that the algorithm was developed using company resources, making it the intellectual property of Langdon Global. They will drown us in discovery requests. We will spend the next 10 years in civil court fighting over digital breadcrumbs while Miles finalizes the sale and disappears to a country without an extradition treaty." Gordon turned away from the window. The neon light cast harsh, hollow shadows across his face. "I copyrighted the original source code under the Offshore Shell Corporation 3 months before we ever signed the incorporation papers for Maxwell Logistics." Gordon stated, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I paid for the initial servers out of my personal savings. The code belongs to me. It has always belonged to me." "I believe you," Wallace replied, rubbing his exhausted eyes. "But the federal judge handling a last-minute corporate injunction is not going to halt an $80 million acquisition based on an unverified offshore registration. We need the physical root key. We need the original air-gapped hard drive containing the Genesis hash that proves the code existed before the company did. Without that physical drive to verify the timestamp of the encryption, your claim is nothing but a ghost story." Gordon looked at the floor plan of the Langdon Global Tower spread across the bed. The legacy server room was located in the sub-basement 3 levels below the polished marble lobby where he had been humiliated just days prior. 12 years ago, to protect the foundational algorithm from corporate espionage, Gordon had insisted the primary root server remain permanently disconnected from the external internet. It was an island of data heavily encrypted and bolted to the concrete floor. "It is still in the sub-basement," Gordon said. Miles never understood the architecture of the neural network. He is an accountant. He only knows how to count the money the machine generates. He would never dare unplug the legacy server for fear of crashing the automated dispatch system. Wallace leaned back in his creaking chair, staring at Gordon with a mixture of awe and profound terror. "Gordon, do you hear what you are implying? That server is sitting inside a heavily fortified corporate headquarters. You currently have a legal restraining order mandated by a federal judge demanding you remain 500 yards away from your ex-wife and that specific building. If you cross that invisible line, Valerie's legal snare snaps shut. A single security camera, a single observant guard, and you violate your parole. You will be arrested for breaking a federal injunction and trespassing. You will go back to maximum security, and this time you will die there." "I am well aware of the geography of my cage," Wallace, Gordon replied coldly. "Let me hire someone," Wallace pleaded, his voice rising in desperation. "I know private contractors. I know corporate extractors who specialize in this kind of digital retrieval. We can pay them to breach the sub-basement. It is too dangerous for you to be anywhere near that property." Gordon walked over to the bed and stared down at the sprawling blueprint of the tower. A hired contractor does not know the machine. A hired contractor does not know the exact microscopic variances in the security matrix. Miles thinks I am a broken, desperate ex-convict sleeping on a bus bench. He is throwing a massive gala on the top floor tonight to celebrate the merger, leaving the foundation of his stolen empire completely unguarded. Gordon tapped a thick blue line running down the side of the architectural schematic. 12 years ago, during the massive warehouse expansion, Miles complained bitterly about the exorbitant cost of industrial cooling systems for the basement server farm. Miles wanted standard commercial units to save profit margins. I overruled him. I knew the immense thermal load the predictive network would generate. I personally installed these oversized intake shafts leading directly from the south alley to the sub-basement. Wallace stood up, walking over to the blueprints. He stared at the blue lines, the realization slowly draining the color from his face. "Gordon, those are industrial exhaust vents. You cannot physically fit inside those unless the primary fans are completely deactivated." "I wrote the maintenance schedule," Gordon said softly, a dangerous edge creeping into his tone. "Every third Tuesday of the month, the automated system runs a mandatory thermal diagnostic. It shuts down the massive steel fan blades for exactly 45 minutes to recalibrate the ambient temperature sensors. Tonight is the third Tuesday of the month. At 2 in the morning, that intake shaft becomes a silent, hollow tunnel leading straight to the legacy server." Wallace stared at him, breathless. "You have been out of prison for less than a week, and you are planning to break into a corporate fortress using a maintenance loophole you designed a decade ago." Gordon picked up a heavy dark canvas jacket from the back of a chair. "I gave the federal government 12 years of my life for a crime Miles committed. I am not going to let him keep the company I built." The damp city air hit Gordon like a wet towel as he stepped out of the motel. He navigated the gritty, deserted streets, avoiding the main avenues, sticking to the shadows of the industrial district. He rode a desolate night bus toward the towering glass spires of the financial sector. The psychological weight pressed down on his chest with suffocating force. Every distant wail of a police siren felt like a spotlight aiming directly at his face. He was a free man deliberately walking back into the jaws of a prison sentence. He thought of Valerie. He wondered if she truly understood the depth of the corporate bylaws when she handed him that restraining order, or if she was just a willing passenger riding on the wealth Miles had stolen. Her cold, dead eyes in the boardroom fueled his steps, transforming his lingering anxiety into a freezing, absolute focus. He approached the rear perimeter of the Langdon Global Tower. The building loomed against the night sky, a monolith of stolen glass and steel. He stopped in a dark alleyway exactly 501 yards away from the property line. He could see the invisible boundary in his mind. Crossing it meant forfeiting his life. He took a slow, measured breath, allowing the cold air to fill his lungs, and stepped over the line. The shadows of the south delivery alley swallowed him instantly. He moved with the terrifying silence of a predator returning to its den. He hugged the brick wall, anticipating the rotation of the external security cameras. He had placed those cameras himself 12 years ago. He knew their exact blind spots. He waited for the precise 3-second window when the lenses swept toward the loading dock, leaving the industrial exhaust grates completely unmonitored. Gordon slipped beneath the camera arc and reached the heavy iron grate covering the primary HVAC intake. He pulled a specialized titanium wrench from his jacket, a tool purchased with the remainder of Miles's insultingly small hush money check. The mounting bolts were stiff with over a decade of rust and neglect. His muscles burned as he gripped the wrench. His hands, heavily calloused from years of brutal prison labor, clamped down on the metal, forcing the rusted bolts to turn. The grate swung open with a soft, metallic groan. He slid into the pitch-black throat of the ventilation system just as the deep, vibrating hum of the massive steel fan blades ground to a halt. The thermal diagnostic had officially begun. The clock in his mind started ticking. He had exactly 45 minutes to reach the basement, extract the root hash, and climb back out before the fans roared back to life and shredded anything caught inside the shaft. The galvanized steel ductwork was freezing instantly, pulling the body heat through his jacket and directly out of his bones. The space was incredibly tight, suffocating, and completely devoid of light. He dragged himself forward on his elbows and knees. The absolute darkness and the pressing metal walls aggressively mimicked the solitary confinement cell he had barely survived during his 4th year in prison. Panic tried to claw its way up his throat. The physical pain in his aging joints was immense, but the psychological drive effortlessly overrode it. He remembered Miles's arrogant smirk in the boardroom. He remembered the $1,000 check fluttering onto the glass table. The memories acted as a burning furnace in his chest, pushing him deeper into the belly of the building. The horizontal shaft abruptly ended, dropping into a sheer vertical descent. Gordon braced his heavy boots against the smooth metal walls, inching his way down the chute toward the sub-basement. Thick layers of dust coated his throat, making every breath a calculated effort to suppress a violent cough. The ambient noise of the building murmured through the thin metal surrounding him. The faint, rhythmic footsteps of night security guards patrolling the upper floors echoed down through the ventilation network. He stopped moving, holding his breath, blending his existence into the structural hum of the tower. He was no longer an exiled founder standing in the lobby. He was a shadow creeping through the metallic veins of his own stolen empire. The vertical shaft leveled out at a reinforced ventilation grate overlooking the sub-basement corridor. Through the narrow metal slats, Gordon saw the sterile, brightly lit white hallway leading directly to the primary server vault. He carefully unfastened the interior latches of the grate, easing the heavy cover onto the tiled floor, without making a single sound. He dropped down from the ceiling, his boots hitting the ground with a soft, deeply controlled thud. The air down here was heavily climate-controlled, freezing, and entirely sterile. The deep, continuous hum of 1,000 servers vibrated through the thick rubber soles of his shoes. He had reached the heart of the machine. The corridor was monitored by a single stationary high-definition camera. Gordon flattened his back against the white wall, sliding smoothly beneath its arc of vision. He reached the heavy reinforced steel door of the legacy server room. The handle was gone. It had been replaced with a state-of-the-art biometric retinal scanner. Miles had spared absolutely no expense on internal security to protect the data he had stolen. But Miles was an accountant, not a structural engineer. Miles only understood the price of the technology. He did not understand the architecture of the building. Miles did not know that every electronic security lock tied into a central corporate fire suppression matrix requires a manual mechanical fail-safe by federal law. Gordon knelt beneath the glowing red eye of the scanner. He pulled a flat, heavily magnetized piece of steel from his pocket and slid it into the microscopic seam between the scanner housing and the drywall. He probed blindly in the dark crevice, seeking the analog magnetic relay switch he had mandated in the original blueprints 12 years ago. His fingers went numb from the freezing ambient temperature of the corridor. Time was evaporating. The thermal diagnostic would end in exactly 12 minutes, restoring power to the massive intake fans and alerting the overnight maintenance crew to any anomalies in the air pressure. He shifted the metal strip a fraction of an inch to the left, caught the edge of the hidden relay, and applied precise upward pressure. A dull, heavy mechanical click resonated from deep inside the reinforced doorframe. The red light on the biometric scanner instantly flashed to a brilliant, welcoming green. The heavy steel door popped an inch open, breathing out a gust of freezing server exhaust, leaving Gordon staring into the glowing, blinking heart of the empire he was about to reclaim. The air inside the legacy server vault was a punishing, artificial winter. Gordon stood in the center of the humming room, his breath pluming into thin white clouds. Rows of black steel cabinets loomed around him, like silent sentinels, their blinking blue and green indicator lights casting frantic, dancing shadows across his face. The noise was a continuous, deafening roar of cooling fans and processing drives, a digital heartbeat that he had engineered 12 years ago. He did not waste a single second marveling at the machinery. Every vibration beneath the rubber soles of his worn shoes was a countdown. He knew exactly where the root key was stored. He moved past the newer, sleeker arrays that Miles had undoubtedly paid millions to install and went straight to the back corner. There, tucked behind a secondary cooling intake, sat the original mainframe. It was a bulky, outdated machine by modern standards, but it was the undisputed anchor of the entire $80 million logistics empire. Gordon knelt on the freezing tile floor. His fingers were already numb, stiff from the brutal crawl through the ventilation shaft, but his muscle memory took over. He reached behind the metal casing, his fingers tracing the familiar tangle of fiber optic cables until he found the concealed maintenance port. He pulled a solid-state drive from his jacket pocket. It was small, unassuming, but it was the vessel that would carry his stolen life back to the surface. He plugged the drive into the port. A tiny amber light flickered on the device. Gordon pulled a ruggedized tablet from his other pocket and connected it to the array. The screen illuminated his harsh-lined face as lines of code began to cascade down the display. He typed rapidly, bypassing the superficial firewalls Miles had purchased, diving straight into the foundational architecture he had written with his own hands. The system did not fight him. It recognized its creator. A progress bar appeared on the tablet screen. The decryption sequence initiated. 5%. 10%. Gordon stared at the glowing numbers, his jaw clenched so tightly, his teeth ached. This was the exact code he had finalized during his last week of freedom. While Miles had been upstairs shredding financial ledgers and preparing to hand Gordon over to the federal prosecutors, Gordon had been down here in the dark, weaving the dead man switch into the deepest layers of the algorithm. It was the ultimate insurance policy, and now it was finally waking up. 25%. 30%. The cold was seeping through his clothes, turning his joints to lead. He checked his watch. The building's thermal diagnostic window was closing rapidly. He had less than 9 minutes before the massive industrial fans in the exhaust shafts roared back to life, sealing his only exit and trapping him in the sub-basement. He needed the download to finish, and he needed to climb back up the vertical chute before the power grid reset. 50%. Then a sound cut through the steady roar of the server fans. It was not a machine noise. It was the sharp, distinct clack of a keycard scanning at the main reinforced door. Gordon froze. His eyes darted to the heavy steel door at the far end of the vault. The electronic lock beeped a piercing, high-pitched sound that signaled authorized entry. Someone was coming in, not a maintenance worker. The maintenance crew was locked out during the thermal diagnostic. The heavy steel door swung open, spilling warm golden light from the hallway into the freezing vault. Gordon scrambled backward, dragging his tablet and the connected drive behind the massive bulk of the legacy server cabinet. He threw himself flat onto the freezing floor, pressing his body into the narrow, dark crevice between the machine and the concrete wall. He killed the backlight on his tablet, plunging his immediate space into absolute darkness. Footsteps echoed into the room, expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the tile. Multiple people, Step right in, gentlemen. Do not mind the cold. It is essential for the predictive processing units. The voice belonged to Miles Langdon. It was smooth, heavily practiced, dripping, with the arrogance of a man who believed he owned the world. Gordon held his breath, his chest pressing hard against the icy floor. Miles had brought the prospective buyers down to the sub-basement. It was a calculated theatrical move, a flex to show the corporate acquisition team the physical beating heart of the logistics network they were about to spend $80 million on. As you can see, Miles continued, his voice projecting over the hum of the servers. We maintain a fully decentralized neural network. This facility handles routing for over 10,000 active freight vehicles simultaneously. The hardware is impressive, but the real value is the proprietary algorithm running inside these cabinets. It is completely impenetrable. Gordon lay in the shadows, his heart slamming against his ribs like a trapped animal. Miles was standing less than 20 feet away, boasting about a system he did not understand, selling an algorithm he did not own. One of the buyers spoke up, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. And the intellectual property rights are fully secured. We noticed some unusual offshore routing in the early incorporation documents. Miles laughed, a rich, dismissive sound. Ancient history, David. Minor tax structuring from the early days. The code is entirely the property of Langdon Global. We have the ironclad patents to prove it. You are buying a fortress. Gordon glanced down at the solid-state drive still plugged into the legacy server inches from his face. The tiny amber light was blinking furiously. The download was at 85%. The blinking light felt like a beacon in the dark. If Miles or one of the buyers stepped down this specific aisle, they would see the foreign drive. They would see Gordon. The violation of the restraining order would mean an instant trip back to maximum security, and Miles would win forever. 90%. The footsteps moved closer. Miles was leading the buyers down the center aisle, gesturing grandly toward the blinking arrays. Notice the redundancy protocols, Miles was saying, his voice now dangerously near. If one node fails, the system automatically routes the data through the secondary matrix without a single millisecond of latency. It is a masterpiece of efficiency. Gordon pressed his face against the cold concrete, making himself as small as physically possible. The leather shoes stopped at the end of Gordon's row. He could see the polished tips of Miles's shoes just inches past the edge of the metal server cabinet. Gordon stopped breathing. His muscles screamed for oxygen, but he did not move a single muscle. 95%. The blinking amber light on the drive seemed to pulse with the rhythm of Gordon's racing heart. Miles shifted his weight. He was pointing directly at the legacy server, the very machine Gordon was hiding behind. This unit here is our archival backup, Miles explained. We keep it strictly for historical data retention. It is completely isolated from the main network. If Miles took one step around the cabinet to demonstrate, it was over. Gordon slowly, silently slipped his hand into his jacket, his fingers wrapping around the heavy titanium wrench he had used to open the ventilation grate. If Miles found him, there would be no corporate negotiations. There would only be raw, physical survival. 99%, 100%, download complete. The tablet vibrated silently in Gordon's palm. He reached out with agonizing slowness and pulled the solid-state drive from the port. He slipped the drive and the tablet deep into his interior pockets. He had the weapon. Now he just needed to escape the fortress. Fascinating setup, Miles, the buyer named David said. I think we have seen enough of the freezer. Let us head back upstairs and finalize the equity transfers. The champagne is getting warm. Miles chuckled. Absolutely, David. After you. The expensive leather shoes turned and began to walk back down the center aisle toward the main door. Gordon let out a slow, silent exhale, the burning in his lungs slowly subsiding. He waited until the heavy steel door clicked shut and the electronic lock engaged, sealing the vault back into its isolated, humming solitude. Gordon did not waste a second. He scrambled to his feet, his joints aching from the freezing cold and the crushing tension. He had exactly 3 minutes before the thermal diagnostic ended, and the ventilation fans activated. He sprinted silently across the tile floor, reaching the open ventilation grate in the ceiling. He leaped up, grabbing the edge of the metal duct, and hoisted his heavy frame into the dark shaft. He pulled the metal grate up behind him, setting it carefully back into place just as a deep structural shudder vibrated through the building. The massive industrial fan blades 100 feet above him groaned slowly, beginning to spin. The air pressure in the shaft instantly changed, pulling a fierce vacuum. Gordon crawled forward with frantic, desperate speed, his boots finding purchase on the slick metal as he hauled himself upward. The roar of the fans grew deafening. He reached the horizontal junction, threw his body through the opening, and tumbled out into the dark, humid alleyway just as the ventilation system engaged with a violent, roaring blast of air. Gordon lay on the damp asphalt, gasping for breath, the harsh city air filling his lungs. He was out. He patted his chest pocket, feeling the solid outline of the drive. He had the Genesis code. The dead man switch was in his hands. 3 floors below, in the freezing silence of the legacy server vault, the heavy steel door hissed open once more. Miles Langdon stepped back inside alone. He rubbed his arms, shivering against the artificial winter, walking back down the center aisle. He had left his presentation laser pointer on one of the server racks and wanted to retrieve it before the final contract signing. He reached the legacy cabinet and picked up his pointer. As he turned to leave, the toe of his polished leather shoe kicked something small and metallic on the floor. Miles frowned, looking down. Resting on the pristine white tile half hidden in the shadow of the server cabinet was a heavy silver lighter. Miles froze. The air in the room suddenly felt infinitely colder. He slowly crouched down and picked up the object. The silver was worn, scratched from years of heavy use, but the engraving on the side was perfectly clear, catching the blinking lights of the server array. G.M. Gordon Maxwell. Miles stared at the lighter, his breath catching in his throat. This was the lighter Valerie had bought for Gordon on their 5th anniversary. Gordon never went anywhere without it. He used to nervously flip it open and shut during intense board meetings. Miles looked frantically around the empty humming vault. His eyes darted to the dark crevices between the machines, to the ceiling ventilation grates, to the maintenance ports on the back of the legacy server. The implications slammed into him with the force of a freight train. Gordon had been here. Gordon had been inside this room, standing inches away from him, while he was pitching the company to the buyers. Miles stumbled backward, his back hitting a server rack. The invincible confidence that had carried him through 12 years of corporate theft shattered into a million pieces. The ghost was not sitting on a bus bench. The ghost was inside the machine. Gordon had bypassed a multi-million-dollar security grid, infiltrated the deepest, most secure vault in the building, and vanished without a trace, leaving only this silver lighter as a terrifying signature. Miles gripped the lighter so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He looked at the blinking servers, and for the first time in over a decade, he realized he had no idea what the machinery was actually doing. The $80 million merger, his perfect life, his stolen wife, everything was suddenly balancing on the edge of a knife. The ghost was in the building, and Miles knew with absolute paralyzing certainty that the nightmare had only just begun. The morning air inside the grand ballroom of the Financial District Hotel was thick with the smell of expensive coffee and desperate ambition. Miles Langdon stood behind a podium flanked by massive digital screens, displaying the Langdon Global logo. He had not slept. The silver lighter he found in the sub-basement the night before was currently burning a hole in his tailored suit pocket. It was a physical manifestation of a ghost, a promise that Gordon Maxwell was breathing down his neck. The terror of that realization had forced Miles to make a reckless move. He had spent the entire night strong-arming his legal teams to accelerate the buyout. The $80 million merger was no longer scheduled for the end of the month. It was closing on Friday. A sea of financial journalists and industry insiders filled the velvet chairs in front of the stage. Camera flashes erupted like a rapid-fire strobe light, reflecting off the polished veneer of the podium. Miles gripped the edges of the wooden stand, forcing a wide, charismatic smile that masked the tightening knot in his chest. To his right stood David, the lead acquisition representative, looking sharp and incredibly wealthy. To his left stood Valerie, wearing a stunning ivory dress, her posture rigid and perfect. She played the part of the triumphant executive wife flawlessly, but the tight grip she kept on her designer clutch betrayed her own fraying nerves. Miles leaned into the microphone. The screech of feedback echoed for a second before the room fell into a captivated silence. He spoke with the practiced cadence of a man who believed his own lies. He talked about the future of global logistics. He talked about the seamless integration of their proprietary dispatch network. He proudly announced that by Friday afternoon, Langdon Global would officially merge with the largest supply chain conglomerate on the continent, securing an $80 million valuation that would reshape the industry forever. The audience broke into a polite, sustained applause. Valerie stepped forward, placing a manicured hand on Miles's shoulder, smiling for the cameras. It was the perfect corporate portrait. It was the exact moment they thought they had won. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. No alarm sounded. No security guards shouted. A man in a simple gray courier uniform walked down the center aisle, completely ignoring the flashing cameras and the confused murmurs of the press. He moved with a steady, unhurried pace, clutching a thick manila envelope sealed with red legal tape. Miles stopped smiling. His fingers dug into the wood of the podium. He signaled to the security guards flanking the stage, but the courier was already stepping up the side stairs. The courier walked directly up to Miles. He did not ask for permission. He held out the heavy envelope. Miles Langdon, the courier, stated, his voice carrying through the microphone for the entire room to hear. "You have been served." The courier dropped the envelope onto the podium, turned around, and walked back down the stairs. A sudden suffocating silence descended on the ballroom. The journalists stopped taking notes. The flashing cameras froze. David stepped forward, his brow furrowed in deep suspicion. Valerie's perfect smile cracked her eyes, darting between the envelope and her husband. Miles felt the blood drain from his face. He wanted to push the envelope off the stage. He wanted to laugh and tell the press it was a stunt by a jealous competitor. But his hands moved on their own. He tore the red tape and slid the heavy watermarked documents out onto the podium. The words printed at the top of the page were bold, undeniable, and devastating. Cease and desist. Notice of immediate intellectual property theft. Miles scanned the legal jargon, his breathing turning shallow. The document explicitly detailed the foundational architecture of the Genesis Code, the exact neural network he was currently selling. It listed the offshore holding company Gordon had created 12 years ago. It demanded the immediate halt of any commercial sale involving the software, threatening federal wire fraud charges if the transfer proceeded. The signature at the bottom belonged to Wallace Reed. David did not wait for an explanation. He reached across the podium and snatched the document directly out of Miles's trembling hands. The buyer's eyes scanned the page, taking in the legal threat. The color completely vanished from David's face, replaced instantly by a look of pure, concentrated fury. "What is this?" Miles David demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, carrying whisper. "You told me the intellectual property was fully secured. You told me the core algorithm belonged to Langdon Global. This document claims your entire dispatch network is running on stolen offshore software." Miles swallowed hard, trying to project a confidence he did not feel. "David, please. This is a harassment tactic. It is a baseless claim filed by a disgruntled former associate trying to extort us at the 11th hour. My legal team will have this thrown out by tomorrow morning." David leaned in, his eyes hard and unforgiving. "I do not care about your legal team. I care about my $80 million. You are asking my board to acquire a company that might not even own the engine that runs it. If this claim is valid, your valuation is worth absolutely nothing." Valerie stepped between them, her voice smooth and placating. "David, we assure you this is nothing but a desperate bluff. We have the internal records. We will clear this up immediately." David took a step back, folding the cease and desist order and shoving it into his suit pocket. You have 48 hours, Miles. 48 hours to produce the original time-stamped copyright, proving you own the Genesis code. If you cannot put that physical proof in my hands by Friday morning, the deal is completely dead, and I will personally sue you for fraud. David signaled to his acquisition team. They turned their backs on the flashing cameras and walked out of the ballroom, leaving Miles standing at the podium, completely exposed to the ravenous whispers of the press. 10 minutes later, the grand facade was entirely stripped away. Miles and Valerie barricaded themselves inside a private VIP green room behind the stage. Miles was pacing furiously, his hands running through his silver hair, muttering curses under his breath. Valerie stood by the leather sofa, her face a mask of absolute unhinged rage. The pristine corporate wife had vanished. She reached into her clutch and pulled out her mobile phone. She did not call her security team. She bypassed the corporate lawyers entirely and dialed the number printed on the bottom of the cease and desist order. She put the phone on speaker, throwing it onto the glass table between them. The line rang twice before Wallace Reed answered. The old attorney's voice was calm, dripping with a quiet, lethal satisfaction. Law offices of Wallace Reed. How can I help you, Valerie? Valerie leaned over the table, her voice trembling with sheer venom. You listen to me, Wallace. You call off this pathetic stunt right now. You tell Gordon to crawl back into his hole, or I swear to God I will end him. I will send him back to a concrete cell for the rest of his miserable life. Wallace let out a slow, amused chuckle. That is a rather aggressive tone for a woman who just had her $80 million payday frozen. On what grounds do you plan to arrest my client? Valerie slammed her hand against the glass table. He violated the restraining order. We know he was in the building last night. Miles found his silver lighter on the floor of the sub-basement. Gordon breached a secured federal area. That is a felony trespassing charge on top of a parole violation. I am calling the federal marshals the second I hang up this phone. Miles stopped pacing, nodding in frantic agreement. Tell him, Valerie. Tell him we have the physical evidence. There was a brief pause on the line. When Wallace spoke again, the amusement was entirely gone, replaced by the crushing weight of an airtight legal defense. You are going to call the federal marshals over a lighter? Wallace asked, his tone perfectly flat. A lighter that Gordon reported stolen from his jacket pocket while he was standing in your public lobby 3 days ago. A lobby he entered entirely legally before you handed him your restraining order. Valerie froze. That is a lie. He was in the basement. He extracted the data. Wallace interrupted her, his voice slicing through her panic. Gordon Maxwell was sitting in my office last night, Valerie. I have time-stamped security footage of him drinking coffee at my desk. As for the data, my client never set foot inside your basement. The server logs you are currently panicking over will show that the system was pinged remotely. It was accessed via a legal proxy routed through an offshore server. Gordon simply executed a remote diagnostic on software he legally owns. He did not break into your building. He just knocked on his own digital front door. Miles stared at the speakerphone, the blood rushing in his ears. Wallace had anticipated the threat. The lawyer had built a perfect digital alibi, rendering the physical evidence of the lighter completely useless in a court of law. If they went to the police, they would look like paranoid fools trying to frame an innocent man. You are lying, Miles shouted at the phone, losing his composure. He stole the data. He is holding my company hostage. It is not your company, Miles Wallace replied coldly. It never was. You stole the walls, but Gordon kept the foundation. David gave you 48 hours to produce the original copyright. You and I both know that document does not exist in your files. You have until Friday morning to surrender. Surrender to what? Valerie hissed, her voice cracking. Surrender the company. Wallace stated the absolute finality of his words, echoing in the small green room. Drop the restraining order. Sign the corporate charter back over to Gordon. If you do not, the buyers walk away on Friday. Your stock plummets to zero. And the moment the company declares bankruptcy, I hand the decrypted ledgers of your original tax fraud over to the federal prosecutors. You have 48 hours to pack your things." The line went dead with a sharp click. The dial tone hummed through the green room loud and relentless. Valerie stared at the phone, her hands shaking violently. She looked up at Miles, expecting him to have a plan, expecting him to assert his dominance and fix the nightmare. But Miles was perfectly still. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the scratched silver lighter. He looked at the engraved initials, the realization finally breaking him. Gordon had not just breached the building. He had chained them to an impossible choice. They had 48 hours to prove they owned an empire or watch it burn to the ground. The bell above the diner door chimed a hollow metallic note, cutting through the low hum of the refrigerated display case. The scent of burnt coffee and stale frying oil hung heavy in the air, settling over the cracked vinyl booths and the scarred linoleum floor. Gordon sat in the furthest corner booth facing the entrance. He had spent 12 years eating every meal, with his back pressed against a concrete wall, keeping his eyes locked on the room to watch for shifting allegiances and sudden violence. That instinct did not wash off with a hot shower. He took a slow, deliberate sip from a thick ceramic mug. Through the smeared glass of the diner window, he watched a sleek black town car pull up to the curb. The pristine paint reflected the flickering neon sign of the street, a glaring anomaly in a neighborhood built on rust and forgotten promises. The rear doors opened. Miles stepped out first. He was not wearing the immaculate bespoke suit from the boardroom celebration. He wore an expensive dark trench coat thrown hastily over a wrinkled dress shirt without a tie. He looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days. The arrogant posture that had filled the executive suite was completely gone, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy that caused his hands to twitch. Valerie stepped out behind him, pulling the collar of her cashmere coat tight against the evening chill. She looked at the cracked pavement with absolute disgust before following Miles toward the diner entrance. Gordon did not react. He set his mug down on the scratched laminate table. He waited. The diner door opened again, letting in a gust of cold air. Miles scanned the room, his eyes darting past the exhausted truck drivers and solitary late-night patrons until they locked onto Gordon. Miles marched across the room, his heavy leather shoes thudding against the floor. Valerie trailed closely behind him, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Miles reached the booth and slid into the seat directly across from Gordon. The vinyl groaned under his weight. Valerie slid in next to him, pressing herself against the window as if trying to avoid touching anything in the room. The cloying scent of their expensive cologne and perfume instantly clashed with the smell of the diner grease, creating a suffocating bubble around the table. Gordon looked at them. He did not offer a greeting. He did not adjust his posture. He simply let the absolute weight of his silence press down on the space between them. Miles cracked first. He reached inside his trench coat and pulled out a thick document bound in heavy legal stock. He slapped it down onto the center of the table. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the laminate, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You think you are very clever, Gordon." Miles said, his voice a harsh, raspy whisper that carried the raw edge of panic. "You think you can waltz in here after a decade and hold a gun to the head of my company? You think you can use some obscure offshore registration to freeze an $80 million acquisition?" Gordon looked at the document on the table, then back up to Miles. He said nothing. Miles swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming at his temple despite the chill in the diner. "The buyers are spooked, Gordon. They gave me 48 hours to produce the original copyright for the algorithm. They are threatening to pull out and sue me for fraud. If they walk away, the stock craters. Langdon Global goes bankrupt before the end of the quarter. You are going to destroy everything we built." "You built nothing," Gordon said, his voice a low, even rumble that betrayed zero emotion. "I built the architecture. You built a forgery." Miles slammed his hand flat against the table, making the coffee cups rattle. "I kept this company alive. I navigated the federal audits. I expanded the fleet. Do you have any idea what it took to keep the doors open after you went to prison? I saved the brand. You stole the brand, Gordon corrected calmly. You forged a board vote while I was sitting in a federal penitentiary, taking the fall for your fraudulent ledgers. You stripped my equity and erased my name. Miles stared at him, his chest heaving. He realized the righteous anger routine was failing against a man made of stone. He took a deep breath, forcing his tone to soften, shifting gears from dictator to negotiator. "All right," Miles said, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "You made your point. You proved you still have teeth. You scared the buyers, and you humiliated me. I concede. Now let us talk about reality. You are a convicted felon living out of a cheap motel with nothing to your name but the clothes on your back. You cannot run a global logistics network. You do not have the capital, the clearance, or the market trust. If you blow up this deal, you get nothing. We all go down together, and the code dies with the company." Miles reached forward and tapped the heavy document resting on the table. 3 days ago, I offered you $1,000 to walk away. I admit that was an insult. I underestimated you. But this right here is reality. This is a legally binding contract transferring the offshore copyright of the Genesis Code to Langdon Global. In exchange, I am prepared to offer you an executive severance package. Miles paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering his masterstroke. $5 million, Gordon. $5 million wired directly into any account you choose, completely tax-free. You sign the last page of this document, and the money clears before the banks open tomorrow morning. You can walk out of this diner, buy a house on the coast, and never have to look over your shoulder again. You win. You beat me. Take the prize and go live your life." Miles leaned back against the vinyl booth, breathing heavily, his eyes fixed on Gordon, expecting to see the hunger, the relief, the desperate grab for salvation. $5 million was an incomprehensible fortune to a man who had earned 12 cents an hour, stamping license plates for the last 12 years. Miles was absolutely certain he had found the exact price of Gordon's soul. Gordon looked at the contract. He reached out and placed his calloused fingertips lightly against the edge of the thick paper. He did not pull it toward him. He did not open it. He just held his fingers there, staring at the blank white cover. He let the silence stretch for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds. He used the silence as a weapon, watching it slowly drain the confidence out of Miles's face. When Miles began to shift uncomfortably, Valerie moved. She reached across the table, her diamond rings clinking against the cheap laminate surface. She placed her soft, manicured hand directly over Gordon's rough fingers. Gordon did not pull away, but he did not return the pressure. He simply stared at her hand, feeling absolutely nothing. "Gordon, look at me," Valerie whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. He raised his eyes to meet hers. She was using the exact same expression she had used in the courtroom 12 years ago. The wide tear-filled eyes, the trembling lower lip, the portrait of a devastated woman begging for salvation. "We never wanted this to happen, Gordon," she said, her voice cracking perfectly on the syllables. "When you went away, I was completely broken. The feds were threatening to seize the house. The bank accounts were frozen. I was terrified. I did not know how to survive without you. Miles stepped in because there was no one else. He kept a roof over my head. He kept me from falling apart. I thought I had lost you forever." Gordon listened to the rhythm of her lies. He remembered the visiting room at the penitentiary. He remembered sitting behind thick, bulletproof glass, waiting for a phone call that never came. He remembered the exact day the warden handed him the divorce papers, citing a complete breakdown of the marital bond. She had not been broken. She had been calculating. She had traded a man in a cage for a man in a corner office without shedding a single genuine tear. "Please, Gordon," Valerie pleaded, squeezing his hand tighter. "Do not destroy the life we have now out of spite. Remember what we used to be. Remember the house we bought together. Remember the plans we made. You took that plea deal to protect me. You sacrificed everything so I would not have to suffer. If you ruin this merger now, you are destroying the very person you went to prison to save. Take the $5 million. Do it for us. Do it for the memory of what we had. Please let us go. She let a single tear slip down her cheek, tracking a perfect line through her expensive makeup. It was a masterful performance designed to weaponize his own loyalty and turn his sacrifice into a leash. Gordon looked at her tear. He looked at the diamonds glittering on her fingers, paid for by the algorithm he had coded in the dark. He felt the vast empty canyon in his chest, where his love for her used to reside. The silence in the diner seemed to amplify, wrapping around the booth like a physical shroud. Gordon smoothly slid his hand out from under hers. He picked up his ceramic mug, took one final sip of the bitter coffee, and set it down. He looked at Valerie with eyes as blank and cold as a frozen lake. "You stopped visiting in year 3, Valerie," he said, his voice devoid of any anger or sorrow. "You stopped writing 3 months after that. Do not sit here and pretend you are a casualty of my absence. You are a beneficiary of my silence." Valerie flinched, as if she had been slapped. She pulled her hand back across the table, clutching it against her chest, her face flushing with sudden hot shame. The victim routine had shattered against the solid wall of his detachment. Gordon shifted his gaze to Miles. He placed his index finger on the center of the $5 million contract. He applied a steady pressure and slowly pushed the document back across the table until it bumped against Miles's coffee cup. "I do not want your money, Miles," Gordon said, leaning forward slightly, the shadow of the neon light carving deep lines into his face. "I do not care about your offshore wire transfers or your coastal houses. You fundamentally misunderstand what is happening here. I am not negotiating a severance package. I am informing you of an eviction." Miles stared at the rejected contract, the panic in his chest instantly igniting into volatile, explosive rage. The mask of the calm negotiator disintegrated completely. He grabbed the contract and slammed it against the table, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You stupid, arrogant old man," Miles hissed, leaning over the table, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. "You think you can turn down $5 million? You think you are going to walk back into Langdon Global and sit in my chair? You are nothing. You are a ghost. You do not exist in the real world anymore." Gordon did not blink. "I own the core architecture, Miles. David gave you 48 hours. You cannot produce the copyright. The merger is dead." Miles bared his teeth in a vicious, feral snarl. "The merger might die, but you will never see the inside of that company again. If you will not take the money, I will use it to bury you. I have a team of 30 corporate litigators on retainer. The second you try to enforce that cease and desist, I will file 100 injunctions against you. I will tie the intellectual property rights up in civil court for the next 20 years. I will drag you through depositions until you are drowning in legal fees you cannot afford." Miles jabbed a finger inches from Gordon's face, his voice dripping with absolute malice. "You will spend the rest of your miserable life walking into courtrooms wearing cheap suits, fighting for a company you will never possess. I will drag this out until you drop dead of old age in whatever pathetic motel you are hiding in. You will die penniless, Gordon. You will die with nothing. I will make sure of it." Miles grabbed Valerie by the arm, hauling her roughly out of the booth. He snatched the contract off the table and shoved it into his trench coat. He glared down at Gordon, his chest heaving with exertion, his eyes burning with the promise of endless destruction. "You made a mistake tonight," Gordon Miles spat, turning toward the door. "I am going to make you bleed for every single day of the next 20 years. Miles dragged Valerie out of the diner, the door slamming shut behind them with a violent crash. Gordon watched through the window as they climbed into the back of the sleek black town car and sped away into the night, leaving nothing behind but the smell of burnt coffee and exhaust. Gordon sat alone in the booth. The threat of endless litigation was real. Miles had the resources to wage a war of attrition that would outlast Gordon's natural life. The legal system was a weapon designed for the wealthy, and Miles intended to use it to bludgeon him into the dirt. But Miles had made a fatal miscalculation. Miles assumed the battle was going to be fought in a courtroom. Miles assumed the machine would keep running while the lawyers argued over who owned the title. Gordon reached into his pocket and pulled out his burner phone. He did not need a lawyer to argue about the machine. He needed to turn the machine off. He dialed Wallace Reed. Wallace answered on the first ring. "Did he take the bait, Gordon?" "He threatened to bury me in litigation for the next 20 years, Gordon said, staring at his reflection in the dark diner window. "He thinks he can keep the servers running while his lawyers bleed me dry." There was a heavy pause on the line. "Then we have no choice," Wallace said, his voice solemn. "The cease and desist was just a warning shot. If he is going to barricade himself inside the company, we have to bring the walls down around him. Do you have the drive?" "I have it," Gordon said, touching the solid-state drive secured in his interior pocket. "I have the route hash." "Then it is time, Gordon," Wallace said. Gordon ended the call. He slid the phone back into his pocket and stood up. He left a $2 tip on the scratched laminate table. He had allowed Miles to believe he was safe behind a fortress of corporate lawyers. He had allowed Miles to trigger the exact conditions required for the next phase. The trap was perfectly set. To activate the dead man switch, Gordon had to force Miles to lock him out of the system one final time. Gordon pushed open the diner doors and stepped out into the freezing night, ready to initiate the end of Langdon Global. The air in Wallace Reed's office tasted of old paper and stale coffee. Dust motes drifted through the slats of the window blinds, illuminated by the amber glow of the streetlights outside. Wallace sat behind his heavy oak desk, rubbing his temples with trembling fingers. The silence stretching between them was heavy with the reality of what Miles had promised. 20 years of litigation. 20 years of court dates, injunctions, and legal maneuvering. "Miles is not bluffing," Gordon Wallace said, his voice rough and defeated. "He has the capital to drag this out until we are both in the ground. The cease and desist scared the buyers, but it did not break Miles. He will just use Langdon Global's liquid assets to build a legal wall we can never climb over. We won a battle today, but we are going to lose the war of attrition." Gordon stood by the window looking out at the city he used to own. He felt the cold truth of Wallace's words settling in his bones. He had spent 12 years surviving in a concrete cell, telling himself that patience was his greatest weapon. But patience was a luxury he could no longer afford. He did not have another 20 years to waste fighting a ghost in a courtroom. He wanted his life back now. "I am not going to fight him in a courtroom," Wallace Gordon replied, turning away from the glass. "I built that system to be an extension of my own mind. I know how it breathes. I know how it panics. If Miles wants to hide behind his corporate walls, we will bring the roof down on his head." Wallace looked up, confusion knitting his brow. "What are you talking about?" "You have the root hash. We proved you own the code. But we cannot legally force him to hand over the physical company without a judge's order." Gordon walked over to the desk and opened his worn canvas bag, pulling out the ruggedized tablet he had used in the sub-basement. "I do not need a judge to hand me the company," he said quietly. "I just need Miles to lock the front door." He placed the tablet on the desk and woke the screen. The green terminal lines reflected in his eyes. 12 years ago, when he was building the Genesis code, he knew Miles was getting careless with the tax ledgers. Gordon had anticipated a federal raid. He had anticipated the government seizing their servers. He had not anticipated Miles framing him, but he had prepared for a hostile takeover. "I embedded a sequence deep inside the base operating system," Gordon explained, his fingers flying across the digital keyboard. "I called it a dead man switch. It is a dormant protocol designed to completely brick the entire logistical network if an unauthorized entity attempts to permanently lock out the original creator." Wallace leaned forward, staring at the screen. "You planted a self-destruct button in your own company." "It is not a self-destruct button," Gordon corrected. "It is a total operational freeze. Every truck route, every shipping manifest, every financial transfer will instantly halt. The screens will go dark. The company will become a billion-dollar paperweight. But there is a catch. I cannot trigger it manually from the outside. The code was designed to defend against external hacking. If I just try to force my way in and shut it down, the system will isolate the threat and keep running. So how do we trigger it? Wallace asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. The switch is tied to the central firewall. Gordon said, his eyes locked on the scrolling code. The system has to believe it is under a massive coordinated assault. It has to believe the core architecture is about to be compromised. If the system detects a critical breach, it will prompt the administrator to execute an emergency firewall update. That update is the trigger. The moment the new firewall engages, it inadvertently activates my hidden sequence, and the entire network locks down. You need Miles to update the firewall, Wallace said, the realization washing over him. You need him to press the button. Gordon nodded. Miles is terrified right now. He knows I have the root key. He knows his buyers are demanding proof of ownership by Friday. He is sitting in his office, staring at his screens, waiting for me to make a move. So we are going to give him exactly what he expects. We are going to scare him into locking himself out of his own house. Gordon initiated a secure proxy connection, routing his signal through a dozen overseas servers to mask his location. He brought up the login portal for the Langdon Global Administrative Matrix. He did not use his old credentials. He used a backdoor he had programmed into the automated dispatch terminal. He hit the execute key. 3 miles away, in the penthouse suite of Langdon Global Miles, Langdon was pouring his 4th glass of scotch. His suit jacket was discarded on the floor, or his tie loosened. He had spent the last 5 hours screaming at his cybersecurity team, demanding they find a way to patch the system and lock Gordon out permanently. Suddenly, the massive flat-screen monitor on his wall flashed red. A harsh electronic alarm pierced the quiet of the office. Miles dropped his glass, spilling expensive liquor across the carpet. He rushed to his desk, slamming his hand on the intercom button. "What the hell is happening down there?" Miles shouted, his voice cracking with panic. The voice of his lead security engineer crackled through the speaker, sounding completely overwhelmed. "Mr. Langdon, we have a breach. Someone is trying to force entry into the primary neural network. They are bypassing the outer firewalls. The protocols are failing." "Is it him?" Miles demanded, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Is it Maxwell?" "We cannot verify the source, sir, but the attack vectors are highly sophisticated. They are targeting the legacy server directly. If they breach the core, they can wipe the entire database." Miles felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. Gordon was not waiting for the lawyers. Gordon was coming for the machine tonight. Miles could not lose the data. If the database was wiped, the $80 million merger was entirely dead. The buyers would walk away, and he would be left with absolutely nothing. "Shut it down," Miles screamed into the intercom. "Cut the external connections." "We cannot, sir," the engineer replied, his voice tight with fear. "The attack is riding in on the automated dispatch frequencies. If we cut those lines, we lose contact with every single truck currently on the highway. We will paralyze the fleet." Miles stared at the flashing red screen. The walls were closing in. He remembered the silver lighter resting on the pristine white tile of the sub-basement. Gordon had been inside. Gordon had touched the servers. Now Gordon was trying to burn the Empire to the ground, remotely. "What are our options?" Miles demanded, wiping the sweat from his eyes. "There is an emergency firewall update pending," the engineer said. "It is a total system lockdown protocol. It will isolate the core algorithm and block all incoming traffic, including the dispatch lines. But it requires top-level executive authorization to deploy. It is a hard reset, sir. It will disrupt operations for hours." "Do it," Miles ordered without a single second of hesitation. "Deploy the update. Lock him out. Lock him out right now." Back in the dusty office, Wallace watched the terminal screen over Gordon's shoulder. A massive wall of red text began to cascade across the display. The system was actively rejecting their connection. "They are deploying the countermeasures," Wallace said, his breath catching in his throat. Gordon did not move. He kept his hands resting on the desk, watching the red text flood the screen. He was completely silent. The trap was springing perfectly. Miles was reacting exactly as Gordon had predicted, reacting out of pure blind terror instead of calculating logic. The red text suddenly stopped. The screen went completely black. A single blinking cursor appeared in the top left corner. Then a string of white text slowly typed itself across the digital void. Protocol recognized. Firewall updated. Deadman sequence engaged. Gordon let out a slow, controlled breath. He leaned back in his chair, the tension draining from his shoulders. "It is done," he said quietly. Wallace stared at the screen, his eyes wide. "What happens now?" "The countdown has started," Gordon replied, shutting the tablet down and slipping it back into his canvas bag. "The code is insidious. It does not shut everything down immediately. It works its way through the network like a virus, infecting the dispatch nodes, the financial routing servers, and the automated warehouses. It will take exactly 48 hours to reach critical mass. By the time Miles realizes what he has actually done, it will be too late." 48 hours, Wallace whispered, doing the math in his head. That is Friday night. That is the exact moment he is supposed to sign the final merger documents at the corporate gala. Gordon stood up, his face hardening into a mask of absolute resolve. "Miles wanted to throw a party to celebrate stealing my life. It is only fair that I provide the entertainment." Gordon walked toward the door of the office. He felt the phantom weight of the past 12 years lifting from his chest. He was no longer a victim waiting for justice in a corrupt courtroom. He was the architect of his own retribution. Miles Langdon had spent a decade building a glass castle on a foundation he did not understand. Now Gordon had pulled the linchpin, and all they had to do was wait for the building to collapse. He stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. The machine was quietly bleeding to death, and on Friday night the entire world was going to watch it die. The crystal chandeliers of the Langdon Global Penthouse cast a fractured, blinding light over the celebration. Waiters in white jackets navigated a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns carrying trays of vintage champagne. At the center of the room, standing on a slightly raised dais that served as the focal point of the corporate gala, Miles Langdon raised a flute of crystal. Beside him, Valerie wore a gown woven from imported silk, a diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. They looked like royalty presiding over a conquered kingdom. The $80 million merger was scheduled to close in less than 48 hours, but the party was already in full swing. The prospective buyers stood in a tight semicircle around the dais, nodding with predatory approval as Miles delivered his victory speech. He spoke of innovation. He spoke of building an empire from the ground up, conveniently omitting the blood and sweat of the man who had laid every brick. He raised his glass to the future, to the seamless integration of their logistical fleet, and to the brilliant minds that had fortified the company against any external threats. He caught David's eye in the crowd, offering a smug, self-satisfied nod. The crisis of the cease and desist order was a fading memory. Miles had authorized the emergency firewall update. He had locked down the neural network. He believed he had severed the ghost's fingers from the machine. The applause began to swell, a polite rhythmic sound of wealthy men celebrating their mutual enrichment. Then the heavy brass doors of the executive suite swung open with a resounding, hollow crash. The applause died instantly. The string quartet in the corner faltered, the cellist dragging a discordant note across the strings. Gordon Maxwell walked through the doors. He did not wear a tuxedo. He wore the same outdated, faded suit he had worn the day he walked out of the federal penitentiary. He did not rush, nor did he shrink under the sudden, suffocating weight of 100 staring eyes. He walked with the heavy, rhythmic tread of a man who had paced the length of a concrete yard for 12 years. He was not alone. Flanking his right side was Wallace Reed, the aging corporate attorney clutching a thick leather briefcase. Flanking his left were 3 men in identical off-the-rack gray suits. They did not carry champagne flutes. They carried heavy locked document cases. They wore the blank, unforgiving expressions of federal auditors. Valerie saw him first. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the polished hardwood floor. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the dead, silent room. Her hands flew to her mouth, the color completely draining from her face, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin under the brilliant lights. Miles froze on the dais. The smug, charismatic smile melted off his face, replaced by a twitching, naked panic. He looked at Gordon, then at the men in the gray suits. His mind scrambled to process the impossibility of the scene. The building was supposed to be completely locked down. The security matrix was on maximum alert. Security Miles shouted, his voice cracking the polished executive facade shattering in front of the buyers. "Get security up here right now." 4 heavily built guards in black suits materialized from the edges of the ballroom, converging rapidly on the entrance. They reached toward their belts, moving to intercept the intruders. Gordon did not stop walking. He kept his eyes locked dead onto Miles, charting a straight path through the sea of terrified executives. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a wide, empty aisle for him to walk down. Miles stepped off the dais, pointing a trembling finger at Gordon. "You are violating a federal restraining order, Gordon. You are trespassing on private property. I warned you what would happen if you ever showed your face here again. Officers, arrest this man. Throw him on the ground and get him out of my sight." The lead security guard lunged forward, reaching out to grab Gordon by the shoulder. Before the guard's hand could make contact, one of the men in the gray suits stepped smoothly into the guard's path. The man reached into his breast pocket and flipped open a black leather wallet, revealing a gleaming silver badge. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," the agent stated, his voice flat and booming. "Take your hand off him, son, or you will be charged with assaulting a cooperating federal witness." The security guard froze, his hand hovering in midair. He looked at the badge, then looked back at Miles, slowly backing away. The other guards instantly halted, raising their hands and stepping back into the crowd. Miles felt the floor drop out from under him. The word federal echoed in his mind, triggering a deeply buried primal terror. He looked at David and the acquisition team. They were staring at him with absolute unmasked horror. The $80 million deal was bleeding to death right in front of their eyes. "This is a stunt," Miles stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "This is a desperate, pathetic stunt. He does not belong here. I locked him out. I updated the firewall myself. He has no access to the company. He has no equity. He is a convicted felon trying to extort me." Gordon stopped 10 feet away from Miles. The silence in the room was so profound, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. "You did update the firewall," Miles Gordon said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a judge reading a final sentence. "You updated it exactly when I needed you to." Wallace Reed stepped forward, unlatching his leather briefcase. He pulled out a single sheet of paper stamped with the heavy, unmistakable seal of a federal magistrate. He did not hand it to Miles. He held it up so the entire room, specifically the prospective buyers, could see it. "This is a federal injunction," Wallace announced, his voice echoing clearly across the ballroom. "But it is not a cease and desist. It is a warrant for the seizure of all digital and physical assets belonging to Langdon Global." Miles shook his head frantically. "You have no grounds. The intellectual property claim is baseless. My lawyers are already burying that copyright notice. You cannot seize a company over a disputed software registration." "We are not seizing the company over a copyright dispute," Miles Gordon said, taking a slow step forward. "We are seizing it for wire fraud." Valerie stepped out from behind Miles, her voice shaking with raw venom. "You are insane, Gordon. Miles saved this company from your crimes. He kept it clean. He has never committed fraud." Gordon did not look at her. He kept his eyes burning into Miles. "When you initiated that emergency firewall update last night, Miles, you thought you were locking out an external threat. You thought you were protecting your servers from a hacker. But you do not understand the architecture of the machine you stole. The Genesis code was not just a routing algorithm. It was the bedrock of the entire network." Gordon took another step forward, the sheer force of his presence driving Miles back toward the dais. "I told Wallace that I never transferred the copyright, but I also never removed the original digital watermarks. When you deployed that massive system update, the firewall automatically authenticated every piece of software running on the mainframe to ensure system integrity. To do that, the system had to verify the registration keys of the core algorithm. Miles' breath hitched. He looked at the federal agents, a cold, sickening dread pooling in his stomach. When the firewall verified those keys, Gordon continued relentlessly. It pinged the global registry. It officially and undeniably logged that Langdon Global was operating its entire commercial fleet using a proprietary neural network registered to an offshore shell company. You authenticated stolen property across state and international lines. Wallace smiled, a grim, predatory flash of teeth. By updating the firewall, Mr. Langdon, you created a permanent, undeletable digital paper trail. You officially transmitted stolen intellectual property through federal routing channels to conduct commercial business. That is the exact federal definition of felony wire fraud. And because the valuation of the theft exceeds $50 million, it triggers an automatic mandatory federal audit. David, the lead buyer, pushed his way to the front of the crowd. His face was purple with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at Miles. You used us to inflate the valuation of a company running on stolen assets. You brought us into a federal wire fraud trap. This merger is dead. Langdon Global is dead. No, Miles shouted, reaching out toward David. David, listen to me. I can fix this. I can isolate the code. We can rebuild the routing network. Just give me a week. David sneered, stepping away as if Miles were diseased. You do not have a week, Miles. You do not even have a company. The buyers turned as one and marched out of the ballroom, their footsteps echoing like hammer blows against the hardwood floor. Miles watched his $80 million salvation walk out the door. He turned back to Gordon, his face contorted in a mixture of pure hatred and absolute panic. You planned this. Miles hissed, his hands balling into fists. You baited me with that cease and desist. You knew I would panic and update the security protocols. You tricked me into turning myself in. I did not trick you. Miles, Gordon said, his voice entirely hollow of sympathy. I simply gave you the rope. You were the one who tied the knot and kicked away the chair. You spent 12 years convinced you were the smartest man in the room because you knew how to forge a ledger. But you forgot that I built the room. Valerie stepped forward, her hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. Gordon, please. We can make a deal. We can transfer the company back to you. We can give you everything. Just tell the agents to drop the warrant. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Gordon finally shifted his gaze to Valerie. He looked at the diamonds around her neck. He looked at the terrified, pleading eyes that had lied to him for a decade. He felt nothing. The absolute void in his chest was a profound, unshakable comfort. The agents are not here just for the software, Valerie, Gordon said softly. One of the federal auditors stepped forward, opening his locked document case. He pulled out a thick stack of printed, decrypted ledgers. We executed the search warrant on the primary server an hour ago, Mr. Langdon, the agent stated. When the system locked down last night, the firewall isolated the active drives, but it also dumped the encrypted archival data into the unallocated memory caches to prevent data loss. Miles stopped breathing. The color completely washed out of his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. The agent held up the stack of papers. We found the original offshore tax ledgers from 12 years ago, Mr. Langdon. The unedited files. The ones containing your digital signature on every single fraudulent transfer. The exact transfers you used to send Gordon Maxwell to a federal penitentiary. Valerie let out a choked, horrific gasp. She stumbled backward, bumping into the dais, her hands clutching her chest, as if she had been shot. She looked at Miles, her eyes wide with the realization that the man she had traded her soul for was about to lose everything. Miles stared at the ledgers in the agent's hands. The walls of the grand ballroom seemed to warp and bend around him. The opulent celebration, the tuxedos, the champagne, all of it dissolved into the cold, harsh reality of the concrete cell waiting for him. He had spent 12 years building an impenetrable fortress, only to realize Gordon had buried a time bomb in the foundation. You have the right to remain silent, the federal agent said, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Gordon watched as the agents moved in surrounding Miles and Valerie. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply turned his back on the ruined empire, leaving the uninvited guests to their silent reckoning. The federal agents stood in a loose perimeter around the dais, their faces carved from stone. Miles Langdon was suffocating in the center of his own ballroom. The heavy, decrypted tax ledgers were still resting in the hands of the lead auditor, a physical manifestation of a 12-year lie. But Miles was a creature of absolute delusion. He believed that money could rewrite reality. He believed that if he could just force the $80 million merger to close, he would have the capital to bury the federal indictments in endless litigation. He turned away from the auditors and lunged toward the sleek glass terminal mounted on the center podium. "David, please." Miles begged, his voice echoing through the silent room. "Do not listen to them. The software is clean. The network is fully operational, and it belongs to me. I will prove it to you right now. I will initiate the master digital handover protocol. I will transfer the entire logistical matrix to your corporate servers. Once the handshake completes, the company is yours, and this federal circus becomes a clerical error." David stood near the edge of the stage, his expression a mask of cold revulsion. He did not agree to the transfer, but he did not stop him either. The lead acquisition buyer simply watched, waiting to see if the desperate man on the stage could actually produce a miracle. Miles slammed his hands onto the glass console. The massive 30-foot digital screen suspended above the stage flared with brilliant light. The display shifted from the corporate logo to a live, high-resolution map of the North American continent. It was the visual pulse of Langdon Global. Thousands of glowing green nodes pulsed across the map, representing active freight routes, automated warehouses, and dispatch centers. Streams of silver light flowed between the nodes, illustrating the real-time transfer of millions of dollars in logistical data. It was a breathtaking empire of efficiency, a masterpiece of digital engineering that Gordon Maxwell had coded in the dark. Miles stared at the glowing map, his breathing ragged and shallow. He typed his executive credentials into the terminal. His fingers slipped on the smooth glass slick with cold sweat. He entered his passwords, his security clearance codes, and the final authorization keys required to surrender the network. He believed the emergency firewall he had activated the night before had purged Gordon from the system. He believed the fortress was secure. Gordon stood at the base of the dais, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his faded suit. He did not try to stop Miles. He simply watched the massive screens above. He knew exactly what was moving beneath the surface of the glowing green map. The deadman switch he had embedded a decade ago was not a blunt instrument. It was a quiet, creeping infection. For the past 48 hours, it had been silently moving through the shielded pathways of the network, bypassing every security protocol by masking itself as a routine maintenance diagnostic. It had woven itself into the dispatch servers, the financial routing hubs, and the automated navigation grids. It was waiting for the exact moment of critical mass. Miles hit the final execution key on the glass terminal. He let out a loud, desperate bark of laughter, a sound completely devoid of joy. There he shouted, pointing at the screens. "The transfer protocol is initiating. The network is yours, David. The company is secure." For a fraction of a second, the thousands of green nodes on the massive map pulsed with a bright, intense light. Miles smiled, his shoulders dropping, as he believed he had finally won. Then the eastern seaboard went completely dark. It happened with a terrifying silent speed. The clusters of green lights hovering over New York and Boston simply vanished, swallowed by a wave of absolute blackness. Miles stopped smiling. He leaned closer to the glass terminal, his eyes wide with sudden, paralyzing confusion. Before he could touch the keyboard, the darkness spread. A vicious digital rot ripped across the map. The silver streams of data flowing through the Midwest suddenly turned a sickly amber color before snapping entirely. The automated dispatch hubs in Chicago and Detroit logged catastrophic failure codes, blinking furiously for 3 seconds before dying. The freight routes spanning the southern highways dissolved into static. "What are you doing, Miles?" David demanded, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the ballroom. "What is happening to the network?" Miles furiously slapped his palms against the glass console. "I am not doing anything!" He panicked, his voice cracking in terror. "The system is rejecting the handshake. The firewall is supposed to be holding." The cascade failure accelerated. The network was tearing itself apart from the inside out. The automated warehouses on the West Coast registered critical lockouts. The financial routing servers handling the billing for 10,000 active clients severed their connections, dropping millions of dollars of pending transactions into the digital void. Every single truck currently operating on the highway lost satellite navigation and dispatch communication simultaneously. The massive map above the stage flickered violently as the last remaining nodes in the Central Plains turned a deep blood red. The servers were screaming in silent agony, trapped in an infinite loop of localized lockouts. Miles hammered his fists against the terminal, pulling up the emergency override screens. A flood of red error text cascaded down his personal monitor, moving far too fast for any human to read. "It is crashing." Miles whispered, his face inches from the glass, his reflection warped by the chaotic red light. "The core architecture is completely freezing. I cannot stop it. I have no access." Gordon stood completely still, watching his creation commit suicide. It was a flawless execution of the silent reckoning. The algorithm had detected the attempted transfer of stolen property and reacted exactly as it had been programmed to react 12 years ago. It had severed the spine of the company. On the massive screens above the stage, the last red node blinked and died. The map of the continent dissolved into a sea of gray static before going entirely black. The brilliant light that had illuminated the ballroom was suddenly extinguished, casting the sea of executives, buyers, and journalists into deep, heavy shadows. The glass terminal in front of Miles emitted a single sharp tone. The entire Langdon Global Network, a logistics empire that had taken a decade to build, was officially a lifeless husk. A single line of crisp white text appeared in the center of the massive black screens hanging above the stage. It did not display an error code. It did not offer a reboot protocol. The text hovered in the darkness for every single person in the room to read clearly. Property of Gordon Maxwell. The silence in the grand ballroom shattered into absolute chaos. Board members shouted over each other, scrambling toward the exits. Financial journalists held up their phones, capturing the undeniable proof of the corporate collapse. The federal auditors simply closed their document cases, their work entirely finished. David took 3 long steps away from the stage, putting as much distance between himself and Miles Langdon as physically possible. He looked up at the white text burning on the black screen and let out a harsh, disgusted breath. "You do not have a glitch," Miles David said, his voice projecting over the rising panic of the room. "You have a dead machine. The infrastructure is gone. The proprietary software is locked out, and the federal government is standing in your ballroom with your forged tax ledgers." Miles turned away from the terminal, his face a mask of complete devastation. "David, wait," he pleaded, taking a step toward the edge of the stage. "The hard assets are still valuable. The physical trucks, the warehouses, we can salvage the hardware. We can negotiate a reduced valuation." David buttoned his suit jacket, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. "There is no valuation, Miles. The network is the company, and the network belongs to the man standing behind you. Our offer is formally and permanently withdrawn. Langdon Global is currently worth absolutely nothing." David turned his back on the stage and walked out of the ballroom, followed closely by his entire acquisition team. The $80 million lifeline evaporated into the stale air of the room, leaving Miles completely alone. Miles dropped to his knees on the carpeted stage. He stared blankly at the floor, the reality of his total ruin finally crushing the last remnants of his arrogant delusion. He had lost the company, he had lost the money, and he was going to lose his freedom. Valerie snapped. The polished, pristine facade of the perfect corporate wife violently disintegrated. She looked at David walking away. She looked at the federal agents waiting by the stairs. She looked at the massive black screen displaying her ex-husband's name. The sheer gravity of her poverty hit her like a physical blow. The penthouses, the imported silk gowns, the coastal properties, they were all gone. She was going back to the miserable, desperate life she thought she had escaped. She lunged across the stage, her expensive heels digging into the carpet, her hands curled into claws. She charged down the stairs directly at Gordon. The federal agents shifted to intercept her, but Gordon raised a single hand, waving them off. He did not move as Valerie crashed into him. She grabbed the lapels of his faded suit, her face contorted into an ugly feral mask of rage. She shook him violently, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the cheap fabric. "Fix it!" Valerie screamed, her voice a raw, piercing shriek that echoed off the high ceiling. "Turn it back on Gordon. Give it back to us. You cannot do this to me. You cannot take my life away. I will not go back to nothing. I will not be poor again because of your pathetic spite." Gordon stood like a pillar of concrete. He did not try to pry her hands off his chest. He did not try to calm her down. He simply looked down at her, watching the absolute panic consume her features. "You owe me," Valerie shrieked, her voice breaking into ragged, frantic sobs. "I gave you my youth. I waited for you while you sat in that cell. You owe me this company. Tell the machine to turn back on. Give David the code. Give him the code right now, or I will kill you myself." She beat her fists against his chest, a pathetic, useless assault that generated absolutely no reaction. She was weeping openly now, her makeup smearing down her cheeks, destroying her immaculate presentation. She was a woman entirely stripped of her power, begging the man she had discarded to save her from the consequences of her own treachery. Gordon let her scream. He let her empty every ounce of venom and desperation from her lungs. He listened to her demand the return of a life she had purchased with his blood. He felt the heavy gaze of the federal agents, the remaining board members, and Wallace Reed watching the miserable spectacle unfold. When Valerie's arms finally grew heavy, when her screams devolved into breathless, gasping sobs, she collapsed against his chest, her fingers still weakly gripping his suit. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for a single drop of the unconditional love he used to harbor for her. Gordon looked down at the woman who had sold him to a federal penitentiary. He lifted his left arm slowly, deliberately, breaking her weak grip on his lapel. He pulled back the worn cuff of his suit jacket, exposing his bare wrist. He did not look at her tears. He did not acknowledge her begging. He simply tilted his wrist and looked down at his watch, noting the exact second. The second hand ticked past the 12. The Empire was dead. The silence was absolute. Gordon Maxwell had finally reset the scales. The ballroom remained trapped in a suffocating silence following the sudden blackout of the massive screens. David and his entire acquisition team were already gone. Miles stood on the raised dais, panting heavily. The three federal auditors in their identical gray suits moved forward. They stepped onto the stage with synchronized precision. The lead auditor placed his heavy document case onto the glass terminal. He did not ask for permission. He opened the case and pulled out a thick black cable. He plugged the cable directly into the main data port of the console. Miles lunged forward to stop him. He raised his fist to strike the federal agent. Wallace Reed stepped directly into his path. The old attorney planted his feet and stared Miles down. "You assault a federal officer, and you will not even make it to a trial," Wallace said, his voice echoing clearly across the empty space. Miles froze. His fist hovered in the air. He lowered his arm slowly. His entire body trembled with unchecked panic. The lead auditor tapped a rapid sequence of keys on his own secure tablet. The massive screens above the stage flickered wildly. The stark white words declaring the property of Gordon Maxwell faded into the deep black void. A new image began to form. It was not a map of logistics or freight routes. It was a raw, unfiltered data stream. Thousands of lines of binary code cascaded down the 30-foot displays. The text glowed with a harsh, brilliant light. The room watched in absolute bewilderment. The financial journalists scrambled to raise their cameras. They sensed blood in the water. The rapid clicking of shutters filled the quiet room. Miles looked up at the giant screens. He did not understand what he was seeing. He wiped a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. He turned to Gordon. "What is this?" Miles demanded, his voice cracking under the severe strain. "What are you showing them?" Gordon stood motionless at the bottom of the stairs. He kept his eyes locked onto the digital cascade. 12 years ago you needed a scapegoat," Gordon said, his voice perfectly level and devoid of all pity. "You funneled millions of dollars out of the company accounts to fund your private ventures. You knew the federal regulators were closing in on your offshore holdings. You needed someone to take the fall. So you manipulated the server logs to point directly at my workstation. You framed me for the exact crimes you committed. You stole my freedom to buy your innocence." The cascading code on the massive screens suddenly locked into place. The binary numbers transformed into highly structured financial ledgers. The columns displayed dates and routing numbers and massive dollar amounts. Every single transaction from a decade ago was projected in 30-foot letters. The press members in the audience pushed forward against the stage. The blinding flashes illuminated the pale, sweating face of Miles. He stared at the ledgers. His mouth hung open. The undeniable numbers documented every stolen penny. "You burned those files," Miles whispered, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "You swore you wiped the offshore drives before the federal raid. You told me the original records were gone forever." Gordon took a slow step up the stairs toward the dais. "I did not burn them," Gordon replied. "I encrypted them. I buried them underneath the base code of the primary operating system. The files were protected by a recursive cipher. Anyone trying to access them would only find corrupted, unusable data. I designed the cipher to require a very specific key to unlock. I needed the system administrator to manually execute a localized network quarantine. I needed you to hit the panic button. When you locked down the firewall tonight, you inadvertently provided the final decryption key. You unlocked your own confession. You broadcast your guilt to the federal government." The lead federal auditor typed another command into his tablet. The screens magnified a specific section of the ledger. A glaring red box highlighted a sequence of digital signatures. The signatures authorized the transfer of $6 million to a private shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. The date next to the transfer matched the exact week Gordon was arrested. "Look at the routing metadata," Gordon commanded, his voice slicing through the rising murmur of the crowd. "Look at the origin terminal." The screen zoomed in further. The digital footprint did not match the engineering department. It matched the executive suite. It matched the personal terminal belonging to Miles. The entire ballroom let out a collective gasp. The financial journalists began typing frantically into their devices. The undeniable proof of a massive historical fraud was broadcasting live. Miles stumbled backward. He hit the edge of the glass terminal. He grabbed the smooth surface to keep from falling. "This is a complete fabrication," Miles shouted wildly. He pointed a trembling finger at Gordon. "He manufactured these files to frame me. He is a convicted felon seeking revenge. You cannot trust a single number on that screen. He hacked the displays to ruin me." The lead auditor turned to face the room. He spoke with absolute bureaucratic authority. "We do not rely on unverified data," the auditor stated clearly. "The search warrant executed on your sub-basement servers allowed our forensics team to capture the raw, unallocated memory cache. The ledgers projected above us match the physical drive data exactly. We have independently verified the digital signatures. The routing protocols match your personal biometric logins from 12 years ago. There is no fabrication. We possess the complete, unedited history of your offshore embezzlement. The transfer nodes point directly to accounts in your name." Miles looked at the auditor. He looked at the massive screens projecting his guilt to the entire world. He looked down at his own trembling hands. He was entirely trapped. There were no more corporate lawyers to hide behind. There were no more board members to manipulate. The $80 million merger was dead. His empire was dead. His freedom was entirely gone. Valerie watched the screens from the corner of the stage. The diamonds resting against her collarbone caught the harsh white light of the projected ledgers. Her pristine posture completely collapsed. She understood the exact implications of the numbers glowing above them. She knew the federal government would freeze every single asset tied to the Langdon name. The bank accounts would be locked. The coastal properties would be seized. The luxury cars would be impounded. She was going to be left with absolutely nothing. Her entire reality was dissolving into thin air. Valerie turned her gaze away from the screens and looked at Miles. Her eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. She had married a man she believed was invincible. She had traded her loyalty for financial security. Now the man standing before her was a pathetic, ruined criminal. "You lied to me," Valerie screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet ballroom. "You told me the company was clean. You told me Gordon was a thief. You used me to legitimize your stolen wealth." Miles reached out a hand toward her. "Valerie, please," he begged, his voice pathetic and weak. "I did it for us. I built this life for you." "Do not touch me," Valerie shrieked, swatting his hand away violently. "I will not let you drag me down into a federal prison. I want a divorce. I am testifying against you. I will tell them everything I know. I will give them every password and every safe combination you possess." Gordon watched the two traitors turn on each other like starving animals. He felt no vindication. He felt no joy. He only felt the cold satisfaction of a balance restored. 12 years ago, they had stood in a polished courtroom, holding hands while a judge sentenced him to a concrete cell. They had worn masks of sorrow while securing their stolen fortune. Now they were tearing each other apart in front of a crowd of strangers over the ashes of their fake empire. The lead auditor stepped forward, holding a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Miles Langdon, you are under arrest for felony wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the obstruction of a federal investigation," the auditor announced. "You have the right to remain silent." Miles did not fight. He did not argue. He simply let his arms fall to his sides. The auditor snapped the cold steel around his wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed through the microphone on the podium. Two other federal agents moved in and grabbed Miles by the arms. They turned him around and marched him off the dais. Miles did not look at Valerie. He did not look at the journalists. He kept his head bowed in absolute defeat. He was a broken man walking into a dark tunnel. As the agents led Miles down the center aisle of the ballroom, Gordon turned his back to them. He looked at Wallace Reed. The old attorney offered a slow, respectful nod. The long war was finally over. The ghost had returned from the dark and reclaimed his life. The truth had systematically dismantled the lies. Gordon reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver lighter. The lighter Valerie had given him over a decade ago. The object Miles had found in the freezing server vault. Gordon ran his thumb over the engraved initials. He walked over to the edge of the stage where Valerie stood weeping over her shattered reality. He tossed the lighter onto the floor at her feet. The silver metal clattered against the polished wood. "Keep the memory." Gordon said, his voice a low, quiet rumble. "It is the only thing you have left." He turned and walked down the stairs of the dais. He walked past the flashing cameras and the stunned silence of the remaining crowd. He pushed through those heavy brass doors and walked out into the cool night air. The city lights burned brightly in the distance, but Gordon did not look back. He simply kept walking forward. The lead federal auditor did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The absolute authority of the federal government filled the dead air of the grand ballroom. He recited the Miranda rights with a flat, mechanical rhythm that systematically stripped Miles of his humanity and his power. Miles stood completely paralyzed inside his custom-tailored tuxedo. The fabric was spun from Italian wool, but it suddenly looked and felt like a straitjacket. He did not resist when the two heavily armed agents stepped to his sides. There was no physical struggle. Violence was a currency for the desperate and the poor. Miles had always fought his wars with shell companies and legal injunctions, but those expensive weapons were entirely useless against the cold, unforgiving steel closing around his wrists. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place was the loudest sound in the room. It echoed against the crystal chandeliers and the polished glass of the ruined server terminal. Miles looked down at his bound hands. He had spent 12 years building an impenetrable fortress of wealth and influence. He had bought politicians, silenced competitors, and lived as a king among men. Yet a ghost from his past had dismantled his entire empire with a single remote command and a briefcase full of undeniable truth. He raised his heavy head and looked at Gordon. He expected to see a triumphant smile. He expected cruel gloating or a demand for an apology. But Gordon simply watched him with the mild detachment of a man watching a dead tree finally fall in the woods. Valerie took a slow, deliberate step backward away from her husband. The pristine facade of the loyal corporate wife shattered, instantly replaced by the raw, primal instinct of absolute self-preservation. She looked at Miles as if he were a carrier of a lethal disease. The man she had traded her soul for was no longer a billionaire visionary. He was a federal inmate. Valerie turned her back on him completely. She smoothed the front of her imported silk gown and turned her full attention to the lead federal auditor. She forced her rapid breathing to slow. She summoned the exact expression of fragile innocence she had perfected over a decade of manipulating board members and sympathetic judges. She widened her eyes, letting a single, perfectly timed tear pool in the corner of her vision. "You have to understand," Agent Valerie said, her voice trembling with a carefully calibrated vulnerability. "I had absolutely no idea what he was doing. I am just his wife. Miles handled all the corporate finances. He kept me completely in the dark about the offshore accounts and the server architecture. I never understood the technical side of the business. He told me the algorithm was legally purchased. He told me Gordon had confessed to the tax evasion. I am a victim of his lies, just like everyone else in this room. You cannot hold me responsible for the crimes of a man who deceived me for 12 years. Miles jerked his head up, staring at the woman he had showered with stolen wealth. The betrayal hit him harder than the handcuffs. He opened his mouth to scream at her, to expose her complicity, to tear down her fragile lie, but the lead agent tightened his brutal grip on Miles' arm, forcing him to remain silent. Wallace Reed stepped forward, the heavy leather briefcase hanging from his hand. The old attorney had spent the last decade watching arrogant executives lie through their teeth to save their own skins. He did not feel a single shred of pity for the weeping woman in the designer gown. He unlatched the briefcase and pulled out a fresh stack of documents. The papers were stamped with international banking seals and official notary signatures from the Cayman Islands. Wallace adjusted his glasses and looked at Valerie with profound, unmasked disgust. "You are a remarkably talented actress," Valerie Wallace said, his voice echoing clearly through the quiet ballroom. "For 12 years you played the tragic victim of a criminal husband. You let the world believe you were simply a passive beneficiary of a logistical empire. But you made a fundamental error when you decided to underestimate Gordon Maxwell. Gordon did not just decrypt the primary ledger tonight. He tracked the entire financial circulatory system of your stolen wealth. He traced every single dollar from the moment it left Langdon Global to the moment it landed in your personal offshore accounts." Wallace separated 3 distinct pages from the thick stack and held them up to the harsh light. He turned his body slightly to address the lead federal auditor. 12 years ago, when Miles Langdon orchestrated the massive embezzlement that framed my client. He did not act alone, Wallace explained. The Shell Corporation registered in the Caymans, the very same entity that held the stolen Genesis code, required dual authorization to establish its financial charter. Miles could not open those massive accounts by himself without triggering immediate federal oversight algorithms. He needed a secondary signatory. He needed a trusted partner to legally bind the stolen assets. Wallace turned his cold gaze back to Valerie. Her perfect mask of innocence began to violently crack. The color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. Wallace stepped closer to her, holding the documents just inches from her face. "These are the original incorporation papers for the offshore shell company," Wallace stated, his tone utterly devoid of mercy. They contain the digital and physical signatures required to finalize the theft of $50 million. The primary signature belongs to Miles Langdon. The secondary signature securing your status as the 50% equity partner belongs to you, Valerie. You did not just benefit from the crime. You were the legal architect of the fraud. Gordon stood silently watching the absolute destruction of his former wife. The agonizing pain he had carried for 12 years, the sleepless nights spent wondering why she had abandoned him, completely evaporated into the cold air of the ballroom. He remembered the exact date stamped on those incorporation papers. He had seen it when he decrypted the files in the dark diner. Valerie had signed the final authorization documents on the exact same Tuesday that Gordon had been denied his first legal appeal. While he was sitting in a freezing concrete room listening to a warden tell him he would not be going home. Valerie was sitting in a luxury office signing her name to a stolen fortune. She had not been scared. She had been busy. "That is a forgery!" Valerie shrieked, her voice losing all its calibrated sweetness and dissolving into a raw, frantic panic. "I never signed anything. Miles forced me to sign blank pages for the household taxes. He forged my signature on those corporate documents. I demand to call my lawyers. You cannot prove I knew what those accounts were holding." The lead federal auditor stepped past Miles and looked directly at Valerie. The auditor did not care about her tears. "The federal government does not rely on circumstantial assumptions," Mom, the auditor said mechanically. "We have already secured the communication logs between your personal encrypted email server and the offshore banking representatives. You actively managed the stolen portfolios. You personally authorized the transfer of illicit funds to purchase your coastal estates, your luxury vehicles, and your private stock options. You are not a victim of Miles Langdon. You are his unindicted co-conspirator." Valerie stumbled backward, as if the auditor had physically struck her in the chest. She looked around the empty ballroom, searching desperately for anyone who could save her. The powerful buyers were gone. The sycophantic board members had fled. The corporate security guards were staring blankly at the floor. She was completely and utterly isolated. As of this exact moment, the auditor continued, his voice echoing with absolute bureaucratic finality, "All of your financial assets are completely frozen under federal forfeiture laws. Every bank account registered to your name, every piece of real estate you own, and every stock portfolio you manage is currently locked, pending a massive criminal indictment. You are no longer a wealthy woman. You do not have the capital to hire a legal defense team. You do not have the funds to buy a cup of coffee. You are entirely and completely bankrupt." Valerie dropped to her knees on the polished hardwood floor. The heavy silk of her expensive gown pooled around her like a collapsed parachute. She pressed her trembling hands to her face, her shoulders shaking with violent, ragged sobs. The terrifying reality of her absolute poverty crushed the breath from her lungs. She had spent 12 years orchestrating a perfect life built on the bones of an innocent man. Now the federal government was stripping the flesh from her own empire, leaving her with nothing but the horrifying prospect of a concrete cell. Gordon watched her weep. He did not feel the urge to offer her any comfort. He did not feel the need to hurl insults or demand pathetic apologies. He simply looked at the two people who had destroyed his past. Miles was standing in handcuffs, a broken king, staring emptily at the floor. Valerie was kneeling in her ruined gown, weeping bitterly for her lost millions. They were exactly where they deserved to be. Gordon turned his back on the wreckage. He looked at Wallace Reed and nodded once. The old attorney returned the quiet gesture, packing the damning documents back into his heavy leather briefcase. The long, silent reckoning was finally complete. Gordon Maxwell walked away from the dais, his footsteps steady and measured. He walked out of the grand ballroom, leaving the architects of his misery to face the cold, unforgiving machinery of the justice system they had once manipulated. The night air outside the hotel was sharp and clear. Gordon took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the intoxicating scent of absolute, undeniable freedom. 1 week later, the heavy steel chains rattled against the wrought iron gates of the coastal estate. A federal auditor secured the massive brass padlock and stepped back. He did not offer a sympathetic glance. He simply turned and walked to his waiting government vehicle. Valerie stood alone on the damp concrete sidewalk. The morning fog was thick and suffocating, rolling off the ocean and settling over the manicured lawns she used to own. She wrapped her thin wool coat tightly around her shoulders, shivering against the damp chill. At her feet sat a single leather suitcase. It was the only piece of luggage the authorities had permitted her to pack. Everything else, the imported silk gowns, the diamond necklaces, the modern art. The fleet of luxury cars was locked behind the iron gates, seized under federal forfeiture mandates. She watched the black government vehicles drive away down the winding coastal highway. Their red taillights bled into the thick gray fog until they vanished completely. The silence they left behind was absolute and terrifying. For 12 years, Valerie had lived inside an impenetrable bubble of stolen wealth. She had surrounded herself with caterers and chauffeurs and sycophantic friends who drank her expensive vintage champagne. She had never opened her own doors. She had never carried her own bags. Now the heavy brass handle of the solitary suitcase bit sharply into her palm. Her private bank accounts were frozen. Her platinum credit cards were canceled. The wealthy socialites who had toasted to her health at the corporate gala no longer answered her phone calls. The gravity of poverty was a sudden, isolating shock. Valerie looked down at her hands. The glittering diamond rings were gone, surrendered to the auditors as material evidence of wire fraud. Her fingers looked pale and empty in the harsh morning light. She thought about Miles for a brief, fleeting moment. He was currently sitting in a sterile federal holding facility, wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, awaiting a criminal trial. He possessed absolutely no money to fight. She felt no pity for the man who had elevated her to the top of the world. She only felt a hollow, sickening dread for herself. She had traded a decent man for a wealthy thief, and in the end, she had lost both. The sprawling modern mansion behind the locked gates was no longer a sanctuary. It was a giant, silent monument to her monumental greed. The low rumble of an approaching vehicle broke the quiet rhythm of the crashing ocean waves. Valerie turned her head, hoping it was the cheap local taxi she had ordered with the last remaining cash in her wallet. Instead, a dark blue sedan crested the hill, breaking through the morning fog. It was not a luxury vehicle. It was practical and unassuming. It drove at a steady, measured pace along the winding coastal road, tires hissing gently against the wet asphalt. As the car drew closer, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, catching the glass of the windshield. Valerie instantly recognized the man behind the wheel. It was Gordon. He was wearing a clean, tailored suit. His posture was upright and relaxed. His hair was neatly combed. He looked healthy and rested. The heavy, dark shadows that had haunted his face in the diner, the desperate exhaustion of a man fighting for his survival, were completely gone. He looked like a man who had finally stepped out of a long, dark tunnel into the warm sunlight. Valerie tensed. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. She instinctively prepared herself for the confrontation. She expected him to pull the dark blue sedan over to the curb. She expected him to roll down the passenger window and hurl insults. She expected him to gloat over her total ruin, to revel in his absolute victory. A sick, twisted fragment of her soul desperately wanted him to stop. She wanted him to yell at her. Anger would mean he still harbored feelings for her. Anger would mean she still occupied a space in his mind. She took a tentative step forward toward the edge of the street, her hand tightening frantically on the handle of her suitcase. She was ready to beg. She was ready to apologize. She was ready to weaponize whatever small, pathetic shred of their shared history remained to secure a lifeline. The dark blue sedan did not slow down. It maintained its steady, rhythmic speed, rolling smoothly along the wet pavement. As the car passed the front of the gated driveway, Gordon turned his head slightly. He looked directly at Valerie standing on the lonely curb. Their eyes met through the passenger side window for a single fleeting second. Valerie searched his face for a spark of vengeance. She searched for a flicker of lingering sorrow or a shadow of regret. She searched for anything that would acknowledge the 12 years of pain they had inflicted upon each other. There was absolutely nothing. Gordon's expression was entirely blank. He did not smile. He did not frown. He looked at her the exact same way a man looks at an anonymous stranger waiting for a bus. She was just a solitary shape standing on the side of the road. She was a ghost from a life he no longer inhabited. The connection was completely and irrevocably severed. The history they had shared, the deep betrayal, the courtroom lies, the bitter resentment, it had all been systematically erased from his existence. He turned his eyes back to the road ahead, completely unbothered. The sedan continued down the coastal highway, the sound of its engine slowly fading into the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves. Valerie watched the vehicle disappear around the bend of the cliff. She was left standing entirely alone on the cold, wet pavement. The realization hit her with the crushing, devastating force of a physical blow, causing her knees to buckle slightly. He did not stop because she was no longer relevant to his world. The opposite of love is not hatred. The opposite of love is total, pure indifference. By refusing to stop the car, Gordon had delivered the ultimate and most permanent punishment. He had denied her the closure of a final argument. He had denied her the satisfaction of absorbing his anger. He had reduced her entire existence to absolute insignificance. She was not a defeated rival. She was simply nothing. A rusted yellow taxi eventually rattled up the hill, breaking through the remnants of the fog, and stopped abruptly beside her. The tired driver did not get out to open her door or help her with her luggage. Valerie dragged her single heavy suitcase to the trunk, struggling awkwardly with the weight. She hoisted it inside and climbed into the torn vinyl back seat of the cab, pulling her thin wool coat tight around her shivering shoulders. She stared straight ahead as the driver put the car in gear. She did not look back at the locked iron gates or the empty, sprawling mansion. The taxi drove away down the winding road, leaving the massive estate standing silent and cold against the morning sky. The scales were balanced, and the ledger was finally clean. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom swung shut, sealing off the chaotic noise of the lower floors. The long, polished table stretched across the center of the room, reflecting the morning sunlight, pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Gordon sat at the head of the table. He wore a simple dark suit, crisp and perfectly tailored, finally shedding the faded fabric of his past. He did not lean forward or try to dominate the physical space. His sheer presence was enough. Sitting directly across from him was David, the lead acquisition buyer, who had walked out of Miles Langdon's disastrous gala just 1 week prior. David shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. He had spent his entire career negotiating with desperate men who needed his capital. Today, he was the desperate man. The logistics matrix Gordon had paralyzed was the most advanced routing algorithm on the planet, and David needed it to secure his own corporate survival. We have reviewed the federal injunctions and the copyright authentication. David began, his voice lacking its usual arrogant edge. The Genesis Code and the foundational network architecture are legally yours, Mr. Maxwell. The federal government has completely dissolved Langdon Global and seized its physical assets to cover the embezzlement fines. But the software is clean, and the software is what we came to buy. Gordon rested his hands on the smooth wood of the table. He did not need to review the ledgers or the market projections. He knew exactly what his mind had built. He knew exactly what it was worth. We are prepared to offer the original $80 million, David continued, pushing a thick stack of printed contracts across the table. We will absorb the operational costs of rebooting the servers, and we will handle the logistical nightmare of reestablishing the freight routes. We just need your digital signature to authorize the handover protocol. Wallace Reed sat to Gordon's right, his weathered hands resting quietly on his open leather briefcase. He looked at the contracts, but did not reach for them. He simply waited for Gordon to speak. You are not absorbing the operational costs to do me a favor. David, Gordon said, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet room. You are absorbing them because every day my network remains offline. Your own supply chains hemorrhage money. You need my algorithm to stop your bleeding. David swallowed hard, his throat visibly working against his tight collar. That is a fair assessment, he admitted quietly. We need the code. Gordon looked out the massive windows at the sprawling city below. 12 years ago, he had written the first lines of the Genesis code on a salvaged computer in a windowless garage. He had built the framework while eating cheap canned soup and fighting off exhaustion. He had poured his blood and his absolute genius into a machine that was supposed to secure a future for his family. Miles had stolen that future and buried Gordon in a concrete box. But the code had survived. The code had waited for its creator to return. I will authorize the reboot protocol, Gordon stated, shifting his gaze back to David. But I am not selling the Genesis code. I am licensing it to your firm on a 10-year contract. You will pay a $50 million upfront licensing fee, and I will retain a 10% royalty on all gross revenue generated by the routing algorithm. You will not possess the core intellectual property. You will simply rent it from me. The acquisition team sitting beside David began to murmur in frantic, panicked tones. They had expected to purchase the empire outright. They had expected Gordon to take the money and vanish into a quiet retirement. That is completely unacceptable, one of the junior executives snapped. We do not rent foundational software. We need total control over the network architecture to justify a $50 million expenditure. Gordon did not raise his voice. He did not react to the outburst. He simply looked at the junior executive with an expression of absolute unyielding stone. You have total control over nothing, Gordon replied softly. The network architecture requires a manual decryption key that only I possess. If you walk out of this room without signing my contract, the algorithm remains permanently locked. Your supply chains will collapse within a month, and your competitors will swallow your market share. You are not in a position to dictate terms. You are in a position to survive. David raised a hand, silencing his panicked team. He looked at Gordon, recognizing the terrifying reality of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Gordon had survived a federal penitentiary. He had survived absolute betrayal. He could not be bullied or intimidated by corporate posturing. David reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy silver pen. We accept the licensing terms, David said, sliding the contracts back across the table toward Wallace Reed. Prepare the addendums. We will transfer the $50 million into your designated accounts by the end of the business day. Wallace opened his briefcase and produced the revised legal documents. He had drafted the licensing agreements the night before, knowing exactly how Gordon intended to play the final hand. He slid the papers toward David. There is one final condition, Wallace noted, tapping a specific clause near the bottom of the page. The corporate entity licensing this software will no longer operate under the Langdon name or any of its subsidiaries. The holding company managing the intellectual property has been officially restructured. David frowned, picking up the document and scanning the final paragraph. Restructured to what? Gordon reached across the table and took the silver pen from David's hand. He pulled the final signature page toward him, pressing the metal tip against the thick white paper. Maxwell Logistics, Gordon said, his voice carrying the heavy, profound weight of a resurrected king. The name goes back on the building today. He signed his name with sharp, precise strokes. He did not hesitate. He did not tremble. He legally bound the empire back to its rightful owner, erasing the last lingering shadow of Miles Langdon from the earth. David watched the signature dry on the page. He nodded once, a gesture of absolute defeat and quiet respect. He stood up from the table, buttoning his suit jacket. His acquisition team quickly followed suit, gathering their briefcases and phones. They did not linger to make small talk. They filed out of the boardroom, their footsteps muffled by the thick, expensive carpet. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, leaving Gordon and Wallace entirely alone in the massive space. Wallace slowly packed his briefcase, securing the signed contracts inside. He looked at the man he had fought alongside for over a decade. The war was officially over. The $50 million was secure. The company was rebuilt. "It is done," Gordon Wallace said, his voice rough with emotion. "It is finally done." Gordon stood up from the heavy leather chair. He walked around the long, polished table and approached the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked out over the sprawling metropolis, watching the endless streams of traffic moving along the concrete arteries of the city. He knew his algorithm was guiding those movements. He knew his mind was silently orchestrating the flow of the world below him. Wallace walked out of the boardroom, leaving Gordon to his solitude. Gordon pressed his hand against the cold, thick glass. The silence in the room was absolute. It was not the oppressive, suffocating silence of a prison cell. It was not the isolating, agonizing silence of betrayal. It was the profound, unshakable quiet of a man who had walked through the fire and emerged entirely unbroken. He had ripped his life back from the hands of thieves. He stood by the window, breathing the clean, filtered air of his own kingdom, his chest rising and falling with the steady, powerful rhythm of a man who was finally, truly free. True justice does not always arrive with the loud clash of vengeance or bitter arguments. Sometimes the most profound reckoning is the quiet withdrawal of relevance. When someone betrays your trust and trades your loyalty for empty wealth, they surrender their right to occupy a space in your mind. We learn that healing comes not from destroying our enemies, but from outgrowing them entirely. Holding on to anger only keeps us tethered to the past, while absolute indifference severs the chain, allowing us to move forward into the light of our own restored dignity. If this story of silent justice and reclaimed power resonated with you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below.